They pulled him from the lake, and they say his skin was as blue as the ice on the lake. They checked his pulse and found him stone cold dead. They loaded him into a wagon and took him into town, the body bouncing like a stone as they rode. Whenever it was that the bumping stopped, none of them knew. But when they arrived in town, they found the back of the wagon. He had our full attention as the tale found its crescendo. They had lost the body somewhere, and when they told the sheriff, he made them go back the way they had come to look for it. No matter how much they looked, or how far they went, they couldn't find the frozen body, and wouldn't until morning. The sound of a chip crunching against John's teeth sounded very loud in the space, but we all pushed it out of our minds as we listened. The sound of screams would wake the town as Judge Weller awoke to find the frozen body of his latest victim beside him in his bed, and when the police arrived, he gladly confessed to his crimes. Gabriel gasped when the final blow fell, but we shushed him as we listened. He thought of nothing else for the length of his stay in the county jail. Likely thought of nothing else right up until the rope ended his life. But the stiff, frozen body of Taylor Williams that had found its warmth into his bed. We all sat back, sighing contentedly as we softly clapped. "It's a good one, Craig," I said, nodding appreciatively as the others congratulated him. It was Halloween. And as it was Craig's turn to host the Halloween sleepover, he had been able to tell the first story. One of many I was sure would be shared that night. Craig, Gabriel, John, and I had been friends since kindergarten. Our town wasn't very large, maybe 25,000 people tops, and when we realized we only lived a few streets away from each other, it was a done deal that we would be friends for life. We spent our days riding bikes or playing video games or just enjoying each other's company, and we didn't see an end to those days anytime soon. As we got older, however, Craig and I developed what you might call a bit of a rivalry. Whenever it was video games, Pokemon cards, bike races, or whatever we did, the two of us had to be the best in our friend group. We'd do anything for each other, but it was accepted that our competitions often put us at odds. I was often the one to come out on top in these contests, and as such, Craig had begun to take them kind of seriously. Any opportunity to be the winner was a chance that he took, so when he looked at me to follow his story with something better, I was already waiting. Well, this one is one my dad told me about, and it gave me chills. So they say the guy who walks around Carter May Park after dark, he wears a hooded sweatshirt, and no one's seen his face. He lived to describe it. He told me that everyone called the guy Mr. Toothman, and he was a local legend of sorts. Lots of people had seen him, but no one had ever gotten close enough to talk to him or see his face. Craig pretended to yawn, but the others were enthralled. Gabriel was lying on his stomach, his eyes getting big as he balanced on his hand, and John was nodding his head as he sat with his mouth a little open. I could see the Jolly Rancher he'd been about to cradle in his cheek as it threatened to slip out, but he seemed not to realize he was about to lose some of his hard-won candy to the carpet. Well, my dad and his friends decided that they wanted to be the first to see what this elusive Mr. Toothsome looked like, so they went to the park after dark and they camped out near a spot that he said to stop at. Someone at school had told him that Mr. Toothman would stop and feed the birds just after sunset by the little fountain. And as they hid in the bush and waited for sunset, they all told stories of what he might look like. "I bet he looks like a bat with long, pointy teeth and drool coming out of his mouth," said Dad's friend Randy. Craig rolled his eyes, but he was clearly as interested as the rest of my friends. None of them had heard the story before. None of them had any idea of a legendary creature that stalked the park. They had never heard of it because I'd never told it. It was something I'd been saving for tonight. "I bet he looks like an alligator, and his face barely fits beneath the hood," said Teddy. But Dad didn't speculate with them. He just kept watching the bench. It got darker and darker, the bugs tuning up as the crickets and the night birds began their song. He was supposed to show up right after dusk. They'd been told so, and they believed it. But he still wasn't there. And the mosquitoes were beginning to bite. A dog barked outside, but none of them took notice. They were all too enthralled by the story to give it a thought. "I bet he looks like a monster from under the bed," Teddy said. "And when he gets you, he drags you into the dark and swallows you whole." "I bet," said a deep, cold voice, "that he gobbles up naughty children who are out past their bedtimes." They turned. And there he was. His hood was down, but Dad said that he could see his face in the gloom. All three went tearing off as fast as they could, the tooth man right behind them. They ran for home as fast as they were able, his running steps behind him. Dad said that he was making a weird sucking sound like he was trying to stop from drooling at the sight of such tasty flesh. They ran and they ran, but when they got to Teddy's house, which was closer, they discovered that he wasn't with them. Gabriel gasped, but it was pretty expected. They told his parents that the tooth man had gotten him, but they never really believed them. The police were called, and when the boys told them that the tooth man had gotten Teddy, they didn't believe them either. The park was searched, but nothing was ever found. Teddy remains missing to this day, and you could still see the tooth man walking around the park sometimes. They say that he still sits on the bench, feeding the night birds, watching for his next victim to come wandering by. As I finished, the others clapped softly, telling me that it really had been a great story. All but Craig, of course. "Yeah, it was okay. Kind of unbelievable, despite your best efforts, though." "Oh, it's real," I shot back, as I grabbed some candy from my nearby bag. "My dad said that he was there. His friend Teddy was never seen again, and his other friend Randy moved away a few months later. His parents were afraid that he might go missing too. Sold their house, and they got out of town." Craig made a disbelieving noise. "Oh, come on. Like anyone would buy that. You made it all up, just admit it." I glowered at him, my candy still half unrolled. "Are you calling my dad a liar? Because he wouldn't lie to me about something like that." "All right then," Craig said, grinning. "Prove it." I looked at him skeptically. "How?" "Let's go to the Carter May Park right now. It's right down the street from here, like a 10-minute walk. It's already 9 o'clock, so this tooth man should be there. We could see him and get home before my mom wakes up and comes to check on us." I started to decline, but why shouldn't we go? Never mind that we were 4 12-year-olds who were talking about going out well after dark. Never mind that we were children who were talking about going to find a creature that snatches children. It was Halloween. And tonight, anything was possible. Why couldn't we go to the park and catch a glimpse of a real-life monster? Tonight was the night for seeing monsters, wasn't it? "All right, Craig." He started to look a little skeptical, but then I crossed my arms and delivered the final blow. "Come on. You aren't chicken, are you?" And that sealed it. And about 5 minutes later, we were slipping out of his garage and making our way down the sidewalk. The streets were empty. The kids inside asleep or counting their candies, and we had the world to ourselves, it seemed. The odd car rolled by to break that illusion now and then, but our only company on the walk was the scuttle of trash or the flap of a bat in slight wind. It was quiet, the night just beginning to stretch its fingers across the town, and as the moon hung high over the top of us, it seemed that anything really could be possible. The park was lit by intermittent light poles, and the islands of light were welcome reprieves in the murky blackness. We could see the hay sculptures that the town had erected in the park, remnants of its Halloween event earlier that week, and they seemed monstrous in the quiet night. The playground was still covered in the thick, fake spider webs that the town had put there, and it all seemed very spooky to 4 kids out past curfew. We heard the fountain before we came upon it. It was sitting at an intersection of 3 light poles, and they cast an eerie light across the ever-lapping surface of the water. Coins gleamed within the belly of that fountain. We had all glimpsed them greedily from time to time, and as we got closer, we stopped at the sight of someone sitting on the edge of the fountain. He was hunched over, his chin against the back of his hand, and we crouched down as we tried to hide from him. My heart beat a little faster as my eyes bore into him. Was this the tooth man my father had told us about? No way, Gabriel breathed, slouched behind a shrub as we watched the man on the edge of the fountain. I guess you weren't making it up. I told you my dad wasn't a liar, I said. We stood there watching for a few minutes, the fountain the only noise to be heard, before Craig said, Well, let's go see what he looks like then. I blinked. What? Go see what he looks like. You know, if he's a monster, then we'll be the first ones to see his face. John and Gabriel nodded, liking the sound of this. Yeah, John chimed in. Otherwise, how do we know it's not just a homeless guy or something? You ever seen a homeless guy around here? I shot back. But Craig wouldn't be discouraged. Go over there and get a look, or I refuse to believe it's him. I tried to reason with him, but in the end, they wouldn't be swayed. So I started out from the shrub we had crouched behind, as slowly and quietly as I could. There was really no way to sneak up on him. The walkways and the straight shot to the fountain, and the figure was sitting on the rim of said fountain. He was going to see me no matter how I approached, so I just figured I'd move straight towards him. If it was the Tooth Man, I'd have plenty of chances to see him and run. If it wasn't, then they would let me know, and I could feel silly about creeping up on someone in the middle of the night. The closer I got, however, the more my hackles went up. The guy wasn't moving. He wasn't even breathing. And the closer I got, the more the tension rose. I began to expect him to spring up and grab me, to leap up and run at me, and as 20 feet became 10 feet, I could hear my teeth chattering. He just sat there, just leaned against his hand, and I wondered if he was trying to lure me in. I could see his hoodie now, the black fabric covering his face, and I just knew that beneath it, there would be rows of teeth or a slobbering mouth. Or bug eyes. Or... Hello? Are you okay? I asked, reaching out to touch his arm. I expected to be grabbed. I expected to be devoured. I didn't expect him to fall backwards into the fountain with a loud splash. As straw rose around his still unmoving form, I began to understand. As my friends ran up asking what had happened, I realized it had been a scarecrow the whole time. In fact, I could see a second one sitting on the other side of the fountain. My friends laughed as they saw it too, and we all felt silly about being scared of a dumb old scarecrow. Craig was laughing, the tension gone, and I remember thinking how nice it was to see him just enjoying being my friend again. No rivalry, no challenge, just playing like we used to. When I saw something over his shoulder, I felt some of the mirth run out of me. Sitting on the bench across from the fountain, about 10 feet from our little group, was another figure, sitting on a park bench. There was a bag in his hands, popcorn or seeds, and it appeared to be feeding the birds. It wasn't moving. Didn't even appear to be breathing, and it too was dressed in a black hoodie and ratty jeans. The shadowy hood was facing towards us, and the depths were dark enough that I couldn't make out anything within. Craig seemed to grasp that I was looking past him, and when he turned around, I heard him chuckle. Man, these things are everywhere. They probably won't mind if we push them over, right? They're just hay. They're probably just gonna throw them out. I wanted to stop him as he walked towards it, but John and Gabriel were already going to shove the other scarecrows in as it sat on the other side of the fountain. They thought I had done it on purpose, thought I had realized it wasn't real as I came up, and they wanted some Halloween mischief too. I mean, the tension was gone. It was all fun and games again, and I was the only one to see Craig as he approached the bench. They look so real, I heard him half whisper. I could almost believe it was. The thing reached up and grabbed him just as the other scarecrow went into the fountain, and his screams of panic were lost amidst the splash. The hand holding the bag let it drop to the ground, and as Craig tried to pull away, I saw it rise slowly towards the hood. My other friends hadn't noticed yet. They were still too busy with the scarecrow they had pushed into the fountain, and as much as I wanted to move, my feet were frozen to the sidewalk. Craig was begging for help, screaming for his mother, and as the hood came down, I joined his scream I joined my scream of terror to his. They had named him aptly. His head was bald and pink, like the blobfish we had made fun of in science class the year before. His nose was thick and squashy, and his eyes were like little pits in his oddly shaped face. His mouth took up the majority of that face, and it was horrible enough to make up for the rest. His teeth were like sewing needles, a double row of sharp, steely gray fangs, and when he opened his jaws, it looked like he could swallow Craig whole. Craig stopped screaming when that mouth fell over his face, and that was when John and Gabriel figured out that something else was going on. We ran like frightened rabbits, our minds commanding us to get as far from that danger as we could. And I'm ashamed to say that we left Craig there. I mean, there was nothing we could do for him. Craig's mom answered the door after about 5 minutes of pounding and screaming, and she came fully awake when we started trying to tell her what had happened. The cops came in a hurry when she called them, and we took them to the spot where he had been attacked. There was no sign of him, or the man. But there was enough blood to prove that something had happened there. It stained the pavement, the bench. The city would spend days afterward trying to get it off. We were all taken to the station so we could give our statement, and when I told them that my dad told me about that story, about the Tooth Man, they brought him in too. Dad was still in his pajamas, pale, scared, unsure of what was going on, and he hugged me when he saw me. He and my mom had been in the lobby of the police station for a while, and they told them very little about what had happened. They were worried that I'd been hurt or even killed. Seeing me sent relief washing through him. The relief was smothered when I told him that we had seen the Tooth Man. What? The Tooth Man, I reiterated. The one from your story, the one who took Teddy, remember? Dad looked confused. That's impossible, kiddo. No, I said. We saw him. He had the black hoodie that covers his face. He was on the bench beside the fountain. Craig thought that he saw a scarecrow and he went to go push him over. That's when it got him. It's a Tooth Man. You told me about him. You said... It was a story, buddy, he said, looking at the police as if begging them to believe him. I made it up. I never had a friend go missing. I just made up a scary story to tell you. There's no such thing as the Tooth Man. The police let us go not long after. But I think about that Halloween a lot, especially at this time of year. Turns out that Craig had been right all along. And my dad had been a liar. My dad had made up a story I told my friends, and if I hadn't told it, we never would have been in that park that night. No one knows who or what took Craig, but like the Randy from his story, his family moved away not long after. Other people have reported seeing a man in a black hoodie in the park at night, but the police have never been able to substantiate it. The park mostly stays empty now, and the people who use it are the kind who don't like to be disturbed. I mean, it's not a park you take your kids to anymore. And the town built a shiny new park not long after the incident. So if you see a man in a black hooded sweatshirt, steer clear of him. You never know when you might find yourself staring into the toothy maw of the Tooth Man. The smell of spent gasoline and day-old garbage assaulted Derek as he stepped onto the street. He always waited till the sunset to head to McLeod's. That was when the best prospects were out. Derek had wanted the alcohol almost an hour before sunset, but he knew that if he intended to go to bed with someone tonight, he needed to pace himself. A woman might accept a man's advances if she was drunk, but they would rarely spend time with a strange drunk while they were sober. This was a lesson Derek had learned early on, and it was likely the only thing that stopped him from being a full-blown alcoholic. His phone chirped and Derek fished it out hopefully, wanting to see what cutie was texting him so early. He sighed when he recognized Charlene's number, asking if he would be at the bar tonight. Charlene, the one-night stand who wouldn't take a hint. He had slept with her about 5 months ago, and the sex hadn't been worth the constant dodge he now had to run with her. Despite his best judgment, he'd taken her out a few times since their hookup, but he had never taken her to bed again. Derek didn't stop for seconds. And as he put the phone back in his pocket, he knew he'd have to cut her off soon. Besides, he had other prospects these days. As he rounded the corner, Derek couldn't help but see the spotlights in front of the old warehouse that had once been a cannery. The man standing out front was doing his best to catch people's interest, but most of them were heading past without a second look. Derek could feel the urge to drink almost as strongly as the urge to bury someone who lived rent-free in his head. But he stopped for a moment as he looked at the sign strung over the door of the warehouse. Derek scoffed as he read the sign. A truly frightening experience, or your money back. What bullshit. The man looked like the titular carnival barker. His jacket was black, with red thread to accent the cuffs and collar, not to mention the garish gold buttons that glimmered from the dark cloak. He wore a tall, black hat, handlebar mustache, and his grin made Derek think he was not to be trusted. He stood before what looked to be a very old and decrepit warehouse. A place Derek had driven by 1,000 times and never looked at twice. And now it was hung with streamers, cast in a buttery light, 2 searchlights. The windows of the warehouse danced with a murky half-light, like a fire slowly burning out, and the lack of screaming and giggling teenagers coming back out the front door made Derek wary. This time of year, an empty haunted house was always suspicious. Come one, come all, see your greatest fears realized or your money back. Derek turned to face the man with a disbelieving eye. That's so. That's so, young man, be warned. This haunted house is unlike anything you've ever experienced before. The house will show you things you didn't know about yourself and tap into what truly scares you. Derek scoffed, but he fished out a 20 and crumpled 5 and laid it in the box. This better be worth it, Derek grumbled. The barker smiled toothily as he slid the bills into a lockbox. I can assure you, sir, it will be worth every penny. As Derek went inside, his phone chirped. He stopped in the entryway and looked down, seeing a picture of an empty stool with a text that asked where he was. It was from Charlene, because of course it was. She appeared to be waiting to ambush him at his favorite watering hole. He considered just going home and drinking the vodka that he'd been ignoring in the fridge since he'd come home from work, but decided that he wouldn't let her stop him from having a good time. Maybe tonight was the perfect opportunity to break it off with her and make it stick. Derek stepped into a cloud of smoke as a nearby fog machine belched its payload and was suddenly surrounded by an active bar scene. It was pretty well done. It looked just like McLeod, the place he'd been heading. McLeod's was where he often picked up the best trim, and he would likely find himself there tonight sometime. Derek didn't like to go to bed sober or alone. When he was alone and sober with his thoughts, he inevitably thought of her. He groaned as he walked into the bar, wondering if this was one of those religious haunted houses by Mothers Against Drunk Driving. It had all the earmarks: hazy bar, people milling around, shadowy corners where bad actors just waited to jump out and startle you. Derek couldn't believe he had just given his money to one of the religious nuts in their revived miracle tents. He supposed he couldn't be too angry. The man had offered a full refund when he got out. Derek might as well see what there was to the house and got his $25 back. He approached the bar, not imagining that they had any alcohol, but willing to play along. The man behind the counter, dressed in a usual attire that Thomas always wore. Thomas seemed to love dressing like the old man out in a barbershop quartet. Suspenders, handlebar mustache, striped waistcoat, shiny black shoes, and immaculately coiffed hair. As he approached the bar, however, he noticed something different. His face looked like someone had used an eraser to make it a flesh-colored smudge. He looked up at Derek, silent as the grave as he stared eyelessly at him. Derek tried to order a gin and tonic, but the not Thomas just shrugged and went back to what he was doing, turning away from Derek as he got back to work. Hey, I'm talking to you! Derek yelled. But as he tried to reach over the bar and grab the not Thomas by the sleeve, the man walked away and went to serve some other oddly smudged individuals at the end of the bar. They all seemed to have that weird thing going on with their faces. Derek wondered if there was a theme or something, and if so, he didn't get it. He sighed as he sat back down, waiting for the bartender to come back. The smudged Thomas clone was more like the real Thomas than he knew. He and Thomas had gotten into a fight 3 nights ago, and Derek's reception at McLeod's had been icy ever since. It was Thomas's fault, really. If he wanted to bed Jeanette, he should have made his move. Derek wanted her. Thomas wanted her. But Derek had struck first, and now Jeanette was just another notch on his bedpost. The problem was that when Jeanette realized she had been nothing but an evening distraction for Derek, she had switched to one of the other dive bars in town, and now Thomas blamed him for running her off. "I don't know why I bother to talk to you," Thomas had said. "It's like being mad at a dog for eating your sandwich. He's a hungry mutt that only knows he wants to eat." "It seems like the bartender might be a little upset with you." Derek jumped and glanced over at a familiar-looking brunette who had sat down beside him. She was dressed in a short black dress, her leggings artfully ripped, and her shiny black hair hung in her face. When she smiled, he could see teeth that were slowly slipping into unevenness, but he found it charming. The longer he looked at her, the more familiar she seemed, and the less like anyone else he had ever known. "You must have slept with some girl he liked." She was drinking something through a straw with a distinctively fruity smell, but the thickness and the color reminded him more of a bag of blood. As he watched it slide up the straw, he felt a little sick to his stomach. He could see her throat working as she drank, her eyes closing as she enjoyed it, and Derek was powerless to break her stare as much as he wanted to look away. As a trickle ran down the corner of her mouth, he finally found the strength to clear his throat and glance around the smoky bar. This was definitely the oddest haunted house he'd ever been to, and he was beginning to doubt his previous suspicions of a religious experience. Do I know you?" he asked, scanning the bar to see if there was someone else he knew there. The girl was cute, but looking at her made him feel weird in a way he hadn't in a long time. She grinned as she drank, the soupy sound of her drink disappearing up the straw making his skin crawl. It was like listening to someone drain a corpse with a bendy straw. "Not for long, no. You think about me often enough. In a way, I'm the reason you do the things you do. I'm never far from your mind, even though you wish I wasn't. You could try to drink me away, Derek, but I'll never truly be gone." Derek laughed, but there was no mirth in it. He was thinking the woman had captured his earlier thoughts perfectly. "Do you always talk in riddles to people that you just met in a bar?" He turned back, but something was different about her. Had she been wearing glasses before? They didn't really fit the elegant dress she was wearing. They were the thick kinds that librarians sometimes wore, the kind that are more functional than form. She was still pretty, but the glasses looked like a prop on this well-dressed young woman rather than something she needed. Only to people who can't understand plain speech. His phone buzzed. Derek checked it to see that Charlene had sent him another text. She wanted to know how he was, to let her know that she was thinking about him. She was so clingy. Why couldn't she take a hint? Didn't she realize he wasn't being coy when he went home with other women? That he wasn't playing hard to get when he didn't return her calls or answer his door? She wanted to lock him down, but he couldn't stay with her. He couldn't start seeing that body as it lay in the casket, hear her words as she told him that she was leaving. And the only thing that would make it go away. He'd start seeing that body as it lay in the casket, hear her words as she told him she was leaving. And the only thing that would make it go away would be the drink. "I'd like to say that you've grown into a fine man, but we both know it isn't true. You've changed very little since high school, and I doubt you ever will." "Well, that's something to work with. Did we go to high school together then? Were you some little nerd that I never called back? Maybe some one-night stand who I ghosted after I was done?" Had she had the pimples when he first started? He had only looked away for a second, but she had just the slightest hint of acne across her cheek, like a dusting of freckles. They weren't the livid pustules of a teen experiencing her first crop, but the last light kiss of puberty that an 18-year-old might experience before they simply dried up and were no more than a momentary problem after that. She smiled as she noticed him noticing them, and he thought again that her teeth seemed odd, Had she once had braces, maybe? Oh no, we were never intimate. I think you would have liked to be, but... She paused long enough to take a sip of her drink, the liquid having returned by some unnoticed bartender. You were so painfully shy around me. You could speak confidently to any cheerleader or popular girl in school, but you were utterly befuddled by me and my braces and my glasses. Derek was speechless. This girl couldn't be who she was claiming to be. Lisa was... I'm sorry, Derek said, glancing over and seeing someone he hoped he'd recognized. I see someone I know. I should really say hi to them. He slid off the bar stool and onto wobbly legs that almost spilled him onto the floor. The young woman, younger now than she had been at the start, smiled at him as she showed off a mouthful of metal. Take your time, Derek. I don't have anywhere to be. I'll be waiting for you. I'm always waiting for you, she said, throwing the last at Derek's back as he rushed off into the small crowd. He thought the woman's name was Cindy, or maybe Chelsea. He only recognized her from the back because that was the most memorable image of her that he had in his head. Her blonde hair was still long and soft as it rolled down her back, and when he approached, she was talking with a small group of hazy people. Their faces looked scrunched, their features swirls of eraser marks. And when he touched her, she turned around slowly. Thank God, Cindy. Did the guy on the sidewalk talk you into this weird little... But he stopped when he saw her face. Her face was as smooth and featureless as the others. She took one look at him and walked away without any word. Cindy! He called, taking a step towards her before catching sight of a familiar brown ponytail as its owner leaned over the bar. Mary was a staple at McLeod's. She might have been a little too old for Derek, her status as a cougar established before Derek had taken his first drink at the bar, but she had been sweet for an evening. He batted at the ponytail playfully, waiting for her to turn around so he could ask her what the hell was going on. She had been a little icy to him since they had slept together, but surely she'd help him figure this out before he had a freaking breakdown. She turned around angrily when he batted her braid, and Derek saw that she was also smooth and featureless, from eyebrows to chin. She huffed and took herself elsewhere, and as Derek watched, he became aware that most of the people in the bar were women who looked very familiar. One-night stands, old girlfriends, sexual conquests of every flavor, and all of them milling about him like they couldn't see him, or couldn't care less. They pressed in as their numbers swelled, but Derek remembered them all. It was impressive and depressing how many women you could sleep with in a 6-year period, and Derek found that he was adrift in a sea of jaded barflies. They had their own tidal pull, and as Derek tried to push his way to the door, they seemed to pull him back towards the bar with each push he made to escape them. When someone wrapped a hand around his and pulled him back towards a stool, he accepted it without protest. It was not Lisa, and she looked a lot more familiar now. She wore the same ripped leggings and puffy sweater dress that she had been wearing the night of the party. The leggings were no longer just ripped artfully. Derek could see glass shards and torn skin beneath them. Her sweater was dotted with red splotches, and he might have thought that she'd been shot if he hadn't known what had killed her. The left lens of her glasses was a spiderweb, pristine ice broken by a stray rock, and he did remember that. After all, they had buried her in those glasses, and he remembered it being the only thing imperfect about her as she lay in her casket. It was the only thing real about her after the coroner was done making her beautiful again. Why are you here? Derek asked, watching the throng of women as they surged around the bar he was sitting on. It's not enough that I live with your ghost every day. Now I have to see you too. Oh, gee. I'm sorry that I'm the stick you jab yourself with on every occasion. Unfortunately for you, I'm your greatest fear. Not me. Not really. But what I represent. You can't let yourself be close to anyone like you were with me. You can't open up and embrace intimacy. In a way, I'm the manifestation of your issues with intimacy. You bury your fears and woes in endless seas of sex, and you're never satisfied, no matter how much you drink. or how many women you go to bed with, you'll never lose my ghost. Not until you let yourself forget me. His phone buzzed again, and he saw that Charlene had texted him. Her message was a little different this time. She told him that she was sorry for bothering him so much, and how she would stop trying to insert herself into his life. She apologized for not being enough for him and hoped that he had a good night. Derek looked at his phone, feeling his stomach knot, as he thought about how he'd run off another one. She seemed nice. Maybe you could give her a chance. I can't, Derek said. What if I let her down like I let you down? What if I accidentally kill her too? Lisa smirked, and it did interesting things to her broken face. You blame yourself for my death. But did you really have anything to do with it? Derek scoffed. How had he not caused her death? He'd been too focused on drinking and partying to make sure that his girlfriend got home safely. He had stood right there and let her leave with someone else instead of taking her himself. Why do you think that's your fault? I would have left regardless. You no more caused my death than the tree we hit did. Let it go. Derek could see that night, the same night he always saw when it haunted his nightmares. They had been at Marty Jenner's party, one he held before Christmas every year. And Derek was drunker than he'd ever been. Lisa didn't drink. He had dragged her to the party mostly so he could show off his new girlfriend. And it was clear she was done with it. When he tried to kiss her, she had pulled away, telling him that his breath smelled like rotten fruit. He had told her not to be such a prude, and she had told him that she was leaving. Kyle Werner, one of the guys on the football team with Derek, had been leaving too. He was less drunk than Derek, but that wasn't saying much. Derek had been hungover the next day when her mother called to give him the bad news. Kyle had wrapped his vehicle around a tree 3 blocks from his house, killing both of them instantly. Derek had never forgiven himself for that. And he'd stayed pickled for the rest of his life. Looking at Lisa now made him feel even worse. Forget about it. And forget me. Stop torturing yourself. You had nothing to do with my death. Let yourself be happy. And then go before it's too late. She swam before his eyes. It was only then that Derek was aware he was crying. His phone chirped again. He saw that Charlene was calling this time. As he picked it up, he saw the women part, leaving him a clear path to the exit. Give her a chance. A real chance. Let yourself be happy for a change. Derek left, apologizing for being so distant, as he and Charlene made plans to meet up at McLeod's in a half hour. So, said the barker, as Derek stepped back into the street, you discover something truly terrifying? Derek nodded. Yeah, I might have found something I lost, too. He dropped another 20 onto the box as he walked, and the barker smiled as he watched him leave shakily. Ha ha ha! Another satisfied customer. Please, if you're reading this, you have to help me. You have to get me out of here. Go to my apartment. You'll find me in my apartment. I'm inside. I'm trapped in this fucking headset with these haptic sensors all over my body. There's no way of getting out. It feels like they put super glue on the inside of my gloves and the boots. Maybe there's some far more high-tech mechanism at play here, but either way, I'm a prisoner inside of this VR rig. How did I get here? It all started when I woke up and I noticed something strange on my phone. It was a PayPal notification which read, Metaverse Inc., USD $33.52. My brain was still a bit foggy from sleep. I tried to remember what I could have charged to my PayPal account for that amount. I only had a few direct withdrawals set up to PayPal, since most of them went to my credit card. Racking up my brain, I couldn't think of anything that would fit the bill, so I did what anyone else would do. I Googled the word metaverse. I looked to see what the company was before filing a dispute claim. It sounded familiar, and immediately I understood why. If not for the fact that I was half asleep, I would have realized it right away. I mean, there was that Facebook metaverse, right? The 3D VR creation, which had a virtual utopia where people could just go, they shop, socialize, work, play, do whatever else the corporation overlords decided. But I'd never signed up for the metaverse. In fact, I didn't even own a VR. This thing didn't sit right with me, especially since I'd heard recently that the metaverse was hemorrhaging cash. The whole operation was failing miserably. The article I'd read about 10 billion in losses while there were only a minuscule number of users. There's no way that I'd sign up for that service. I didn't even use Facebook. Though it didn't seem like there was any chance of an accidental purchase. My vivid imagination pictured a nefarious plan at Facebook to use my Pixel phone's Google Play to order the service without my knowledge. I requested a refund through PayPal, saying I'd never received the service or product, since there was no option for I didn't order this shit. Then I went to Twitter to begin to make my aggravation known to the world. I have a couple thousand followers, nothing too outrageous, and most of my tweets get 1 or 2 likes, but when I told everyone about this, they totally lost their minds. People I'd never spoke to before started retweeting, liking, commenting immediately. So this is how they're making back all their lost money, using Google Pay data to subscribe to their shitty service, the one that no one wants? Ha, said one reply. LOL, I hope you get refunded. That's a pretty sneaky way to get people to pay for the metaverse. I heard they weren't doing well, but this is ridiculous, another person commented. The tweet was getting far more traction than my usual ones, but then it was suddenly removed. I received no reason from Twitter, and when I tried to repost it again, nothing happened. Every time I hit send, it seemed like it went through, but when I went to check the tweet, it had vanished again. Annoyed, I was about to post my experience on Instagram or Reddit when I received an email from Metaverse Inc. customer service. Subject, incidental charge. I opened the email and was surprised to find that it was a customer service manager at Metaverse. Reading the content of the email, I began to feel a strange knot growing in my belly. It felt like someone was pouring cement down my gullet, and it was hardening and drying in my gut, getting heavier and heavier by the second. Dear Mr. Group, the email read, we at Metaverse were displeased to hear that you noticed the recent charge you incurred in our behalf. Rest assured that we are looking into the matter and will provide you with a prompt refund. As a token of our apology, please allow us to offer you an additional gift. We noticed in your tweet that you said you didn't even own a VR. Well, we would like to remedy that situation. VR is a very fun and even therapeutic recreational experience. It is enjoyed by many people, as is the metaverse, despite your assertion that it is a wallet-fucking cartoon world built on lies for enjoyment of idiots. As such, we would like to afford you with the opportunity to experience it. The metaverse should be enjoyed by all, and one day it will be. For you, we would like to provide a free HTC headset with haptic bodysuit for your use. Of course, it will be your decision should you wish to participate in the metaverse, but we hope that you will give it a shot. Thank you sincerely for bringing the situation to our attention. Sincerely, the Metaverse team. After reading the email again, I read it 3 more times. Are they serious? Is this a prank, a joke? Viral marketing? What the fuck's going on? I was suddenly very scared. It occurred to me that I've been talking shit publicly about one of the world's largest and most powerful corporations. They could easily have me killed or silenced. They could have probably wiped my entire life if they wanted to. And no doubt they could destroy my career in the tech industry, and they could make my YouTube channel vanish into the world of shadow banned trash. The doorbell rang and a chill ran up my spine. Is that them? Are they here? Are they at my front door? Come on, no, that's ridiculous. Still, my legs were trembling when I got up and walked to the front door. I opened it, my heart skipped a beat. Jumping backwards, I yelped in fear as a large drone helicopter was hovering just overhead. For a second, I thought that it would charge forward, slicing my neck with its razor-sharp robot-controlled rotor blades, but instead, a screen lit up on the front of it showing a green smiley face. Thank you for choosing the metaverse, it said in a robotic voice. Then it took off into the air, disappearing into the clouds. The fuck was that? I asked no one in particular. Then looked down to see there was a large package on my doorstep. I picked it up with a growing feeling of anxiety, bringing it inside. After a moment of deliberation, I decided to open it. This was clearly the gift promised by the Metaverse people, but I hadn't expected it to arrive so quickly. Normally, corporations were slow to respond, taking weeks to send things by mail, but this had arrived within a few hours of my tweet. Everything about this was disturbing and giving me a dystopian sort of vibe that I didn't like. Still, I unboxed it and looked inside, finding a gleaming HTC VR rig with all the state-of-the-art haptic technology to go along with it. I mean, sure, I'd never owned any of this stuff, but I'd definitely researched it. I was salivating at the opportunity to one day own a VR rig, but I'd never been able to afford one, especially not one like this, one which cost thousands of dollars. A handwritten card was inside the box as well, which I opened and read. Please enjoy, with our sincere apologies, the Metaverse team. It still didn't make sense to me how they could have done all this with such a short period of time, but then again, I'd heard that Google was always listening. So maybe this was just further proof. Despite my misgivings, I decided to set up the VR rig. Got it all hooked up and powered it on. There was even an entire haptic bodysuit, I realized, to go along with the gloves and boots. Trying on the outfit, I noticed that it fit perfectly, as if it had been tailored to my specific dimensions. I put the gloves on and the footwear next. With all the haptics on, I took a deep, unsteady breath and put the VR goggles on my head, tightening the straps around my chin. A moment after I put it on, my entire field of vision became infused with imagery. After a few seconds of looking around, I understood where I was. I was in the metaverse. I mean, surprisingly, it was pretty impressive. At least to someone who'd never really used VR before. Wow, I said to myself, glancing around. Yeah, wow, a woman's voice said, as I saw a cartoonish lady coming around a corner. She had raven black hair and a scowl etched on her face. Do you have any idea how much effort it takes to create a place like this? She said, approaching me quickly. And you go on Twitter and you shit all over it. A second later, she was practically on top of me, and then she threw a punch hard at my gut. The impact in my midsection caught me completely off guard. It reminded me of being back in elementary school when a bully would beat the shit out of me during recess and knocked the wind out of me. This was just like that, except 100 times worse. I was still recovering my breath and on the ground on my hands and knees with no memory of how I got there when she kicked me in the ribs. The blow was so powerful through the haptic bodysuit that it sent me flying, tumbling sideways in a barrel roll. My real body crashed into my entertainment unit, smashing my television and shattering broken glass everywhere. It dug into my flesh, and I felt blood filling the suit in places. Do you have any idea how hard we worked, only to find our efforts mocked? The next kick was to the back of my knee, and I heard it break in a bone-shattering pop. I screamed so loud that the neighbors must have heard me, unless all of their Google Home devices malfunctioned at the same instant, playing a brief blast of loud music and drowning out my screams. The idea occurred to me after the woman left me half-conscious in a pool of my own blood, spitting out teeth and crying in pain. I hope you enjoy this place we made for ungrateful people like you, was the last thing the woman said as her avatar vanished. Because you're going to spend a long, long time here. She was right. I tried to take off the VR goggles, but they were completely sealed onto my face. Same with the gloves, boots, and haptic bodysuit. I'm a prisoner inside the virtual reality getup, while one after another the metaverse employees file in to kick the living shit out of me in every way possible, taking out their frustrations on me. I'm not sure how long it's been. I'm not even sure if this is getting out there. I eventually escaped from that section of the VR world and found this old-school computer in an internet cafe in the metaverse. After trying every avenue on it, attempting to contact help from the other side world via Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, I gave up and went on Reddit, hoping to kill some time. And this subreddit popped up on my feed, and I noticed it's filled with other experiences from people like me, people who had things that aren't normal happen to them. Maybe this post will just blend in, but maybe, just maybe, someone else will notice it. I'm not holding out on hope for a rescue. At this point, I just want to warn you all. If you notice a change on your credit card, PayPal, or bank account, which says it's from Metaverse Inc., don't dispute it. Whatever you do, don't tweet about it or complain on Facebook or Instagram about it. Just quietly pay it. and every charge that follows. Because trust me, the alternative is much, much worse. Sharks have always had an evolutionary advantage when it comes to survival. I mean, they know how to beat it. They know the value of patience. They've survived the meteors, the floods, even the Ice Age. From a scientific standpoint, it would be easy to assume that a species, which has withstood millions of years of change, could likely handle anything thrown at it, and for the most part, that'd be correct. But nothing could have prepared them for the drought. Historians say that it started due to a shifting in the rotation of our planet during the early part of the 23rd century. Conspiracists, on the other hand, claimed that an underwater anti-energy missile was tampered with. Environmentalists cited global warming, politicians blamed whoever was currently trending in the polls as an opposer, and atheists blamed God. But one thing all of them could agree on was this: the oceans were receding. By 2347, experts claimed only 40% of the world would still be covered by water. We needed a miracle. What we got was Jonas Sinto. Jonas was born to an affluent family in New Detroit circa October 2365. From an early age, it was clear that he was a savant and was on the fast track for greatness. Then the accident happened. Jonas was 3.5, and his parents had chosen to take him solar sailing near the Alaskan ridges. Everything was supposed to be perfectly safe, but a miscalculation in the firing sequence caused their sailor to crash near the base of the ridge. A search party headed by the Alaskan lifeguard found the remains of Jonas's parents and 5 other passengers about 12 days later. Jonas himself was presumed dead, likely crushed by the waves. But that's not what happened. Instead, the Offlanders found him, a group of nomadic explorers that believed the world's future depended on saving the oceans. Some called them cultists, but they treated Jonas fairly over the next 18 years. When he did learn of his origins, the boy who fell to the sea did only what could be assumed natural for anyone in that situation, and chose to honor his parents and his new life by creating the New Oceans Marina Research Labs in their name. Most people who heard of the resurrected prodigy donating his fortune towards the research of astral aquatics scoffed at the very notion. There was simply no way that Jonas would be able to afford to create a working space station capable of housing millions of underwater life forms. And they would have been right, had it not been for the long trust that he had established with the Offlanders. It should have been unlikely to happen at all, but the nomads didn't care about fame or fortune. All they wanted was their faith to be restored, for the oceans to rise once more. It took 10 years, 9 months, and 12 days. But eventually, the Aquarius was finished in 2398. Jonas made the announcement at the United Nations seminar that the station would launch at the turn of the century. For a world that had ravaged its resources to the point of global starvation and a drop in population by 19%, it was certainly the good news that everyone needed. But whatever hope the Aquarius provided was dashed to pieces on January 7th, 2399. A group of terrorists calling themselves extinctionists sabotaged and hijacked the space station, taking Jonas and 13 scientists who were on duty hostage toward the stars. What relative peace that had once occurred because of Jonas's promise was broken, causing wars to erupt across the planet once more. Worse still, a few weeks later, the station went dark. Rumors quickly spread that the extinctionists had massacred the scientists before offing themselves. That was 20 years ago, and to most, it's become something of an urban legend. The ocean in the sky. The foolish dream to save our world. but not for us. We see the dreams of one man as the only chance to make it into the next century as a species. Ernest T. Valsetto, Chief Executive Officer of the Ager Foundation. The following notes and experiences have been faithfully compiled by our Terran historian, Dr. A.T. Dajan. Departure, July 13th, 2422. Cape Canaveral, Florida, former head of the North American Space Administration. Vincent Retland watched as the young cadet made another round in the simulated treadmill, increasing the gravity density from 0.07 to 0.13. The artificial intelligence by her side made the adjusted calculation in mere seconds, but the human took considerably longer. She's a poor replacement for Labonte, Vincent thought, shaking his head and checking the chronosphere again. Launch was in less than a week. There wasn't time for mistakes to be made. The next time the young woman made the lap, Retland raised his hand for her to stop and shut the program down. "Your data sheet betrays your skills, Miss Strom. I was expecting more from you today," Vincent said as the woman left the simulation and caught her breath. "It's been a while since I won those medals," the 20-something former athlete argued. "Even so, should have made the adjustment in your resume. Not that it matters either way. It's not like there are other Olympic swimmers available," Vincent grumbled. "I'll practice 3 times a day if that means I can prove to you that my recommendation from President Dykrast was well-founded," she said defiantly. "I couldn't care less who allowed you to be a part of this expedition or why. What matters to me are the results. So, up your daily regimen to 6, show me progress by next Friday, or I promise I will call your precious sponsor myself and see to it those medals are taken away so fast your head'll spin." Redland snapped back. He knew the words would come off bitter and sharp to the young woman, but this was no time for coddling. The stakes could not be higher. July 17th. Dennis Allen needed to get his head back in the game. The launch was only a few days away. In the short period of time that he had worked for the Coalition, everything had gone to pot as a result. Dennis was starting to think that maybe he was cursed. First, during the Carolina starvation, he lost his son. Then he discovered that his accounts had all been seized by the new foundation on their claims for repurposing the country. It was a load of crock, but so was most politics in this day and age. Power vacuums existed in almost every corner of the world thanks to the drought. In so many ways, Dennis felt that going to Aquarius would be a godsend in comparison to the madness that he faced every day on Earth. Alan didn't quite understand how it was that Ager Foundation had managed to gather a crew in such a short period of time, but as he made it to the bay on the day before departure, he was starting to get a clearer picture. He saw scattered and frightened individuals from all backgrounds mirroring the same sense of escapism that he longed for. These people were thankful for the American coalition, even managing to scrounge the parts together to get to Aquarius. It was clear by their determination and anxiety that each of them was prepared to do whatever was necessary to make this work. That was because Aquarius wasn't just about saving the oceans anymore. It had lingered above Earth as a forgotten dream for too long. Dennis could tell each of the crew felt the same way. They had to succeed. They had to save their dying world. Mission Report, July 21st, 2422. Acting Commander Reggie T. Kinsler. I've sent our departure stats to Control, and it appears that we're on schedule to arrive at Aquarius in T-minus 13 hours. The crew is lively. A group of 19 men and women that, under ordinary circumstances, I'm uncertain would be able to work together so cordially. But these past 3 months have been hardly conforming to what would be considered a redundant schedule. We've worked hard, with the limited resources that we had, to finish this project in secret. We couldn't ask for another flummox like what happened with Jonas. It's interesting how I find that my thoughts turn to him as I watch Earth fade away. This world was on the brink of collapse. And this lost child managed to bring hope again to millions of people, even if it turned out to be false. It kept the species going long enough for this to be possible. Aquarius. I don't know much about the place except for what Control has provided us. For all intents and purposes, we'll be landing blind. I provided the blueprints to Jonas's original model to my security detail, 3 men, 1 woman, and informed them that it is quite likely the layout may have changed since its original launch. Our mission is twofold. We scout out the entire station and also determine if any portion of the facility can stand to be used or repurposed for terraforming another world. Control believes that if one of these goals can be achieved by the fall of Solstice, that we can possibly begin a process of selecting people from Earth to live here and make the Aquarius a colony of sorts. It will become more than a vessel for sea life, but also an ark for mankind, to sail us towards the next frontier, whatever that may be. I just hope that I get to play a part in it. Arrival. Picture, if you will, a long tunnel widening and brightening the way a roller coaster might before dipping off into a plummet. The very stars seem reachable. This is how Aquarius presents itself to us. A quiet, frozen paradise capable of being awakened. But some dreams should be allowed to sleep eternally. For when our ship managed to latch onto the eastern outer ring, I couldn't help but to run scans and notice several key systems still operating functionally. We were expecting to find a dead world marred by the remnants of a long-forgotten story. What we found instead was far worse. Commander Kinsler asked for my team to be the first to scout the entry point. Hannes and Tala took the rear while Beckett and I scoured the north hangar bay. To say the place resembled something more biological would probably be an understatement. There was this constant regression that could be seen everywhere we looked. Barnacles and anemones growing wild across scores of metal and steel. It had been encased in the underwater material for so long, the place resembled a trench more than a working facility of any kind. And yet, amid all this natural chaos, a sense of technology also seemed to carry throughout. Functioning electronic equipment, computer systems, and the like. Aquarius was like a slumbering giant, covered in warts, waiting to be woken up. We spent 4 hours searching the entire outer ring and finding more of the same, just abandoned terminals, overgrown hallways, and a disturbing quiet. This place is a tomb, Tala remarked. I reminded all of us that our orders were to keep the comm system quiet. But that was hardly possible, since each step made the tension rise. It was in our final hour that we finally found something that made me question everything. A massive sealed door that led to the inner sanctum of Aquarius. According to Kinsler, it was designed where the space station had 6 outer nodes or rings that circled constantly around the main central arc, and so far that seemed true. But when I scanned the seal itself, I saw something on the other side. A heat signature, like that of a life form, like someone was watching. After 20 years of isolation, I wondered what sort of creature this might be to greet our arrival. It'd be 6 hours later that I found out. Captain's log. Our first night aboard the station did not go as expected. We set up base camp near a blast door the security team had found. Some of my colleagues wanted to rest and adjust to our changing gravity, but the peculiar scratchings and biological takeover that surrounded me on all sides was too great a mystery for me to ignore. It was here that I first met the beings we'll call the settlers of this strange place. For as I gazed upon the markings, I started to understand that they were of human make. The way ancient glyphs were designed to seal away a tomb. A careful configuration, to be sure, but nothing our group of mathematicians couldn't solve in a matter of hours. The seal opened with a hiss and a shudder, pushing out thick foam similar to what you might see rising on the edge of a lake. And on the other side, we were all shocked to see rows and rows of algae, other sea life, growing freely in the dense corridor. One of the older professors, Vincent Retlin, hypothesized that the inner atmospheric controls have been adjusted to prevent the water from completely evaporating. It's as though we're walking at the bottom of the ocean as we explored these tunnels. But the real discovery didn't occur until approximately 330 hours. Hannes, the hefter of the security team, was scouting ahead towards the first generator room when we heard a scream. I remember the whole group froze as they heard what sounded like his organs being ripped from his body. Now I saw it, standing there, hunched over him like a bipedal piranha. In some ways, the figure still resembled a human with the same bone structure and gait, but for the most part it was merely a shadow of a person that had undergone, undoubtedly, countless surgeries for the sake of survival here. When it heard us approach, it turned its bulbous head towards us and stretched out its elongated eyes to stare at us the way a hungry predator might. Rows of torn flesh from the security officer hung from its mouth with sharp teeth, and for a moment, I wagered the thing might attack us. Thankfully, Kinsler had his wits about him to use a powerful beam of light to ward off the would-be attacker, and for a moment we regained our senses. I decided that we'll not go any further until we fully determine the state of decay of the Aquarius and send all our data back to the Coalition and to Control to await further instructions. Mission Report, July 24th, 2422. We've been here for a mere 48 hours, and already 2 of our small crew have perished. We were not expecting to be welcomed by anyone here, let alone by hybrid machinations of sea devils. I've managed to get Strom to hack into the limited operations the Aquarius has for an assessment of what's taken place over the past 2 decades. Most of the data has been heavily encrypted, so it may take her time to come to a conclusion. In the meantime, I've sent a dispatch to President Dicrest of the situation. Our assumption to repossess Aquarius as a terraforming colony is no longer an option, and I'm prepared to return to Earth and postpone this mission until we come up with a plan to take out this threat. Update. Some of the analysis from Aquarius' database makes absolutely no sense. Over 30 new life forms have been created here using some sort of mutating algorithm designed by Jonas himself. If I'm understanding my science team correctly, it appears Jonas intended for human evolution to alter, along with marine life, in some sort of new world order. Was this meant for us to return to Earth and outlive the drought? Other data seems to imply the mutations were tampered with by the extinctionists, who somehow managed to stay on board during the initial hijacking. Pasler, my chief physicist, has speculated that they developed the hybrid humanoids we saw as some sort of virus intended to wipe out the Aquarius crew but still provide new life to the surface. If this is true, it means that they've managed to create a new type of human base around adapting to an environment without the need for oxygen. It'd simply be ironic that the people who wanted to kill us all wind up being our saviors. But if I have anything to say about it, the history books will always remember them as traitors to our species as a whole. Subliminal 7/26/24/22. I'm finding it difficult to keep the small crew's spirits up. Ever since the discovery that there is hostile life aboard the Aquarius, many of our team seems ready to depart, rather than problem-solve the new obstacle. I'll admit at first, I was also thinking that we didn't stand a chance at making it here, but lately we've come to see that the Aquarius itself has accommodated our needs in unexpected ways. The changing environment's making it easier for us to work. You aren't needing our supplies as much as expected. I estimate we could extend our stay for another 2 weeks if Dicrest believes there's still a chance for us to override the main systems. Unfortunately, there's still a large portion of the data that's been corrupted, and Strom told me the only way that we can learn more is by heading deeper into the station. I'll be dispatching the remaining members of our security detail tomorrow to see what they could find. July 27th, 2422. Stasis. The ship is alive. Commander Kinsler has insisted that our success can be achieved by finding the primary controls of the Aquarius, but I'm dubious. Because how exactly do you override a living creature? He made it towards the central node. The largest concentration of marine life can be found here, and that's when I first saw the new life forms that exist in this hellish abyss. Sharks the size of double-decker buses swimming around freely, devouring the skeleton of a whale, using its carcass as some sort of home base for literally hundreds of smaller sharks. The smaller ones in the species remind me of a mix of hammerheads and spearfish with like long, sharp noses, twisted teeth. What scared me the most, though, was when we walked through the corridor, most of them slowed their swimming pattern. They watched us, intently curious to see where we were going. And then we heard voices. At first I thought it was only in my own distorted thoughts, like a broken sanity that I was hearing the incessant chants, but as I looked about the group, I realized all of us were suddenly paralyzed with that singular word that just kept ringing in our heads. Food, 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 food. Strom looked towards the sharks. Couldn't be a form of telepathy, she asked nervously. Before any of us got a chance to speculate, a scream pierced the air. One of our engineers, Janice, was taken by the creatures. I watched in horror as they dragged her towards one of the airlocks and pushed her into the ocean water alongside the myriad of sharks. Kinsler ordered the guards to raise their weapons, and Strom immediately volunteered to rescue her, but it was over in less than 15 seconds. Despite the lightning speed at which the hybrid sharks managed to pull apart Janice's body, tearing her arms and legs from her torso as though she were a toy doll, I remember every vivid detail. Her dead, frightened eyes, the cascade of blood as the sharks worked like a finely crafted singular unit, each one making certain to not get in the way of the other. And above all of it was a throng of music that played out across the sound system of the Aquarius. The dangerous creatures that called this place home were singing praises to this massacre. A minute later, only Janice's skeleton still remained, and I wondered if some of that marine life on the surface of the massive chamber would clean it up as well. I felt my own partner squeeze my hand anxiously. Kinsler announced after about an hour later that he was going to make the suggestion that we leave this place again to the Coalition. Some among our group are already talking about revolting. Revolting if the answer comes back negatively. July 13th, 2422. Dr. Retlin has requested that I begin a psychologist evaluation of the remaining members after the trauma we were exposed to a few days ago in the main node. We have returned for now to the safety of our ship and only allowed the security detail to roam the Aquarius. This is a hostile place, unlike any we've ever seen before. I remember questioning the motives of the surface for this strict training, but given what we've dealt with so far, I think it's safe to say we actually didn't prepare me enough. Commander Kinsler is preparing for departure, but we've met with a snag. Once we made it within the Aquarius's hold, it seems the gravitational pull of the rings will not allow us to break free unless we can find a way to shut off the generator. Retlin speculates that the extinctionists have likely been guarding the system for quite some time. There's still myriads of questions I have about this entire ecosystem, though. For despite its brutality, I can see that Aquarius is a functioning environment. It thrives, in fact, and each time I venture out, I notice more life flourishing. How is any of this possible? When the humans in charge have devolved into savage life forms. I keep thinking the sharks must serve as a key part of their day-to-day life. Of all the sea creatures we've seen so far, the sharks are the most evolved. The humanoids seem to worship them as gods, and the sharks have even achieved what Mr. Allen called supernatural abilities. I, however, believe there's another portion to this tale that we're not privy to, and I have decided that if we're leaving soon, I'd like to test my hypothesis with or without the commander's permission. It'll be risky, but Tala and Frank have already agreed to help me. The plan is simple, but should we not return, I'll place this record here as a testimony to our actions. Number 1, we'll travel under the hours of morning when the Aquarius seems to be at its most peaceful. I'm not entirely certain what schedule these things seem to keep, but so far, the time here seems to indicate an 18-hour nocturnal schedule, followed by 6 hours of rest. I believe this is partially due to the rotation of the Aquarius being misaligned with the equator, resulting in longer episodes of darkness, and the beings, both marine and bipedal, have adapted to being active during those periods. Number 2, I'll be diving into one of the smaller nodes near the south portion of the core. The smaller sharks that have only recently bred seem to be kept in a quarantine here, and this will provide me with a chance to capture one without risk of danger from the adults. Number 3, we'll dissect the shark's brain to determine how it's been able to achieve the abilities that it's obtained, and what role of any humans played in their new evolution. I plead to whatever god is still listening that we can achieve this goal. And until then, this is Mary Strong, signing off. Discovery. Log of Dr. Vincent Retland. Our primary marine biologist has sacrificed her life to make an astounding find concerning the hybrid that we've encountered aboard the Aquarius. After spending nearly 2 hours prepping and then another trying to lure one of the smaller hammerhead hybrids towards a portion of the tank, one that's meant for surgical operations, Mary managed to trap a male hybrid, 2 smaller females. During the process, she unfortunately lost her life. The larger adults saw through the ruse, and using their modified fins, they managed to pry open the cage and free the 2 females. The young male died in the process as the adults also lodged a part of their spearhead into the lower abdomen. Dennis thinks the adult was trying to prevent us from salvaging the body. Stram insists that we focus on saving the specimen rather than her, as one of the other adults grabbed the hold of her leg and dragged her down towards the murky waters below. I wish I knew how best to express her bravery, but I could say now it's not in vain. Me and 3 other volunteers have succeeded in dissecting the shark's body fully and come to a startling conclusion. It would seem these sharks are fused with artificial intelligence of a sort, designed to modify their brains and provide them cognitive abilities superior to even their human hosts, and their brains have been enhanced to triple their original size. Dennis says that he believes this accounts for the shark's telepathy, also why the humanoids seem to worship them. It's a hive mind mentality. These are alphas here. The humans have become like worker bees. It was a stunning and shocking revelation that made us all question God himself. Fears grip the few of us that remain. With little over half of our ship crew gone, I worry that we may not even be able to return to Earth to warn others of the dangers here. Aquarius is indeed a living, breathing world. From what I've seen so far, it's clearly in opposition to the restoration that we're trying so hard to achieve. It's death incarnate itself. Vincent Retland, Chief Physician. Supplemental information. The chambers to the west of the docking bay were the first that began to flood. The crew of the small Endeavour that had managed to survive for a few weeks aboard the Aquarius were still naive enough to believe that the incident was accidental. They didn't want to believe that the creatures they had encountered, which had ripped them apart and used them as fish food, were also smart enough to end them all. It was obvious that the flooding was meant to end the long stalemate between the 2 groups, and the sharks, which were normally sealed off, were allowed to roam free. Their sense of smell was increased, allowing them the chance to find any runners in less than a minute. Commander Kinsler managed to set a few underwater charges that pulled back the larger species trying to attack, but it was only a temporary delay. The sharks were smart enough that they knew when to expect the charges. The shark could heal their wounds. Some would be stagnant for hours, drifting amidst the flooded corridors like pieces of torn wood. Then slowly they would recover, even with the most brutal harm coming to their bodies. These creatures could adapt to anything. All the while, the worshippers chanted and watched, pleased that the small sacrifices were enough to appease their larger sharks. Kinsler sent out a final message to NASA and the Coalition, begging them to blow Aquarius from the sky. Anything to prevent more madness from spreading. Then the waters pushed in, covering him with a surge as powerful as 50 elephants, and those who came to Aquarius were gone forever. Assessment. The data we received from Aquarius was perhaps the most frightening that I had ever read in my life. To imagine these poor folks struggling to breathe and fighting against what sounded like monsters, it was shocking to say the least. In other parts, horrifying. We planned a memorial service for the unfortunate victims on August 13th, which was attended by well over 300 family members and friends. And afterward, all of us listened to the emergency broadcast from the Coalition. I'll see to it that their efforts to save our species are not in vain. Each and every piece of data collected from the Ager Foundation will be assessed by a team of experts over the next several months. We're going to spend as much time as necessary going forward. Myself and other members of the Council still believe that the resources and technology available on Aquarius are the best chance humanity has for a stable future. If that means that we must send up a dozen more operations to secure the facility, then so be it. We have full confidence that our men and women will do everything in their power to achieve this dream. We're going to do this. We're going to win. Over the next few weeks, President Dicrest implemented several new policies to prepare those involved with the Foundation for attempting diplomatic procedure with the inhabitants of Aquarius. According to the charter he developed, the beings on board the space station were no less human than any other culture on the planet Earth. This included the hybrid sharks that were discovered. Dicrest insisted that we needed to do everything in our power to either come to terms with the superior evolutionary society that was discovered on Aquarius, or else further division would develop between the surface and the isolated abyss. I cannot in good faith continue to support such an action when people's lives are going to be sacrificed for something that could destroy us as being separate from the animals. My colleagues have countered that I am opposed to progress in humanity. Nothing further could be true. But at what point do we concede defeat to beings from the depths? How many more volunteers will we take back? How many volunteers will fight to take back Aquarius? Instead, I feel that replicating the technology Jonas invented here on Earth is the key to our survival, so I'll be taking my leave of this place and pray in good faith they see my reasons are solely for the betterment of our whole species, rather than wasting resources. God forgive me for the dreams that we're conjuring, for I fear that both are leading towards true extinction. Ernest T. Valsetto, Chief Executive Officer of the Ager Foundation. Conclusion. Private logs of President Dicrest, October 24, 22. My team has estimated by the year of 2531 there will be no surface water remaining on Earth. Our options, such as they are, have come limited to one. We must surrender to Aquarius and beg they allow at least a select few of us to join their ranks. The ocean and the sky is the only viable option for preservation of species. The announcement of our dying atmosphere and dwindling resources already caused unrest in 19 countries. At this rate, we may all die before even bowing down to these hybrids. I can't help but feel guilty for the part that I've played in these grand follies. I also fear that if the truth came out regarding the mutation on the Aquarius, our government had a role to play in the original hijacking. At a point, I'd either be deemed a savior of mankind or become a martyr for further evolution. I am uncertain how I review further communications with the newest team to arrive on Aquarius. But it scarcely matters anymore. Whether we live or die, our species is doomed to be slaves to the powers of Mother Nature. It was supposed to be just another ordinary, boring summer job. I needed a way to save money for the upcoming school year, so my geology professor offered to put me in touch with a local caving group. From June to August, the group hosted camps for children ages 12 to 14. Over the course of each 4-day, 3-night session, campers would hike along limestone rivers, learn about underground ecology, receive guided tours of 3 different caves, and even spend the night in one. And along the way, of course, they would be treated to the usual cringy team-building activities, cold, bug-infested showers, and barely edible food familiar to summer camp attendees everywhere. My task on paper was a simple one. I was to guide the campers through the caves in a group of about 20, keep an eye on them while they stayed overnight, and we worked in pairs, which was one guide at the front and another at the rear to make sure that no one got lost. We carried helmets, 3 sources of light, walkie-talkies, first aid kits, and extra rope. Even though the caves that we worked with were well mapped and well trafficked, no one expected anything to go wrong. Well, almost no one. Scoutmaster Dan got his nickname from his khaki short shorts with too many pockets, his knowledge of knots, and his obsession with being prepared. In over 40 years as organizer, Dan Raffled had never lost a camper, and, as he was fond of telling us, he planned to keep it that way. We were expected to find our way through each cave at least 5 times before we even began escorting campers through them, and every guide lived in constant fear that the Scoutmaster would suddenly turn up to inspect their gear equipment or quiz them on first aid procedures. As a college boy from the city with no experience, I had expected Dan to be especially hard on me, but he held us all to the same stern standard. No more, no less. The excitement in the air during those first green, cool weeks of summer was infectious. By the time we had mowed the green lawns of the main campground, cleaned the facility, and learned the layout of each cave, I was surprised by how eager I was for the campers to arrive. Unfortunately, I had forgotten what preteens could be like. The body odor, the bullying, the constant boundary pushing. It was tough enough just to get them quiet and moving in the same direction, let alone to make them understand the importance of safety underground. There were times when I almost wanted one of them to wander off, just so that they'd finally learn their lesson, but then I thought about what it would be like to be alone in the dark, so far underground, feeling the cold, damp air on your skin and knowing that it was just a matter of time until your light ran out. As a new guide, I spent the first 3 weeks at the back of the group, keeping a head count and radioing the leader, Miriam, about our issues. Now, Miriam was a lanky, sunburned redhead who'd worked as a guide for 5 summers now. She had a sheepdog attitude towards the campers. As long as they were all present for each count, she couldn't have cared less about their eye-rolling complaints and snide comments about her height or her freckles. What really mattered to Miriam, the reason that she kept coming back, were the caves themselves. The fast-flowing underground streams, the beautiful alien rock formations that could be found nowhere else, the unique wildlife that had never seen the sun. For her, our work was more like a stroll through a beloved park, with the minor inconvenience of hurting the group of accident-prone campers. Thanks to her enthusiasm, I also began to enjoy my time spent in the caves, except for one of them. It was just my luck, it was that cave where I was told to lead my first tour. Now, in theory, Silverlode Cave was the easiest option for a first-time guide. The other 2 caves, Pine Knot and Church Falls, each had their own drawbacks. Pine Knot Cave was like a maze, with so many levels and passages that sometimes even experienced guides lose their way. Church Falls Cave was small, but there were a few tight squeezes, where 1 or 2 campers inevitably discovered their own claustrophobia and needed to be helped through. Silverlode Cave, however, featured large and well-explored passages, with few pits or other dangers, at least on the main road. Even so, the place gave me a bad feeling. Maybe it was the sheer size of its high-ceiling galleries. No matter where you directed the beam of your headlamp, there was still a lot of darkness left over. It was also the fact that Silverlode was one of the most well-known caves in the area, which meant you might find yourself suddenly face-to-face with other cavers or drunk local teenagers. Miriam and I had never had any problems, but still, there was something unsettling about running into strangers in the lightless subterranean world. I think what bothered me most about Silverlode Cave was the graffiti. It was usually graffiti in the more popular caves, but the images in Silverlode just felt wrong. Worm-like black squiggles. Faces not quite animal, not quite human. Spray painted on the stone and lurid colors of lime green and purple. My heart raced whenever I rounded a corner and caught one of them in the beam of my headlight, sneering at me like it knew some awful secret that I didn't. But then, of course, there was the history of the place. According to Scoutmaster Dan, Native Americans had mined precious metals in Silverlode Cave for centuries, until they suddenly and inexplicably stopped over a millennia ago. Later, during the Civil War, Silverlode Cave had been a hideout for Confederate guerrilla fighters. Imagining some illiterate farm boy getting his leg sawed off by lantern light while listening to the echo of his own screams was enough to make the cave feel hostile, if not downright menacing. Miriam didn't seem to mind or even notice. But she wasn't leading the campers that day. I was. To make matters worse, it was the group's final cave tour, which meant that we'd been spending the night in the cave. I had done overnights before, but only in Pine Knot or Church Falls, never in Silverlode. So far, the worst things to happen were a twisted ankle and a camper who woke up screaming because a cave cricket crawled into her sleeping bag. Between the cool air, the coziness, and the complete darkness, I'd actually found caves to be a pleasant place to sleep. So far. As many times as I had been through Silverlode Cave with Miriam, however, I had never spent the night there, and I wasn't looking forward to the prospect. I knew right away there were 3 boys in the back of my group that day who would be trouble. Alex hid Kyle's lamplight in his bulky pockets. Kyle dumped Sean's water on his head during the safety meeting, and Sean tried to push Alex into the creek on the hike to Silverlode Cave. The trio talked over us constantly, their preteen voices cracking in their humid summer air. When we reached the mouth of the cave, Miriam and I gave them an ultimatum: either behave or go home. It worked for about an hour. With a kind of low churning, they knew that once we were deep into the cave, we wouldn't risk splitting the group unless it was an emergency. Unfortunately, they were right. From my place at the head of the 20 campers, I could hear them, laughing and throwing rocks into the darkness. Even Miriam, who almost never lost her cool, wound up shouting her words, reverberating eerily through the tunnels so that I could hear her anger, but not what she'd said. In fact, there were times I'd wondered whether the voice I was hearing was even Miriam at all. The constant tension grated on my nerves and kept me from paying attention to the things I'm sure that I would have noticed. Things like the shadowy figure that seemed to be following our group. The first time I saw it, I thought it was just another caver, backlit by one of their companions as headlamps. When it appeared again, however, I wasn't so sure. Maybe it was just a shadow that happened to look sort of human. But if it was, then what was casting it? And why did it seem to be moving closer each time? I warned myself to cut it out. There was clearly no one else in the cave with us. We would have heard them, and besides, it was impossible to navigate through the jagged rocks with no illumination. I considered radioing Miriam about it, but I didn't want to risk the campers overhearing and getting scared, or making myself look like an idiot. As it turned out, I didn't have to. We were about 15 minutes from the breakpoint spot when my walkie-talkie started to go off. At first, it was just a rushing sound like the wind or the creek that flowed through the cavern. But then it changed. Gibbering, scratching, a voice whispering my name. Since Miriam's talk button was pressed down, there was no way I could respond to ask her what was going on. I called a halt to the group. Moments later, there was a loud crack, and the noises stopped. We had paused on a low plateau where dripping stalactites hung from the ceiling. It wasn't so low that we had to crawl, but standing up wasn't exactly comfortable either. I was grateful for my knee pads. The 20 campers had packed into a circle, swigging Kool-Aid from plastic bottles and wondering what was going on. Miriam scrambled over to me, her face a mask of pale anger. I think one of those kids pinched my walkie-talkie. Whoever it was, they must have freaked out when you called a halt and dropped it. I heard something rattle when she shook the plastic device. Well, either way, I found it, and it's completely dead. I groaned. It had barely been an hour, and already something had gone wrong. Miriam must have seen the look on my face because she gave my shoulder a reassuring squeeze. You're doing fine. Let's just keep the group close enough to see each other, okay? She bit her lip. There was something she wasn't telling me. Hey, have you noticed that... Ow! Let go, you asshole! Alex, or maybe Sean or Kyle, suddenly started shouting. There was a small rock slide. I'll handle this, Miriam hissed and disappeared. And for a while, it seemed like she did. Since Miriam and I couldn't contact each other by radio, she turned on the infrared setting on her spare headlamp and hung it around her neck, where it bobbed in the gloom like a glowing red light. That way I could be sure that I wasn't getting too far ahead. Except, as we moved through the cave, I could have sworn I saw other red lights moving in the darkness. Some from the back, some closer up. I told myself that it was probably just Miriam's secondary headlamp reflecting in dripping water and mineral veins in the walls. But I knew that didn't make any sense. There were too many of them. They were moving with a will of their own. I tried to distract myself by throwing myself wholeheartedly into the explanation of Silverlode's cave history and the geology. But every time I looked up, the danger in the dark felt closer. 2 hours later, we'd reached the large chamber that would serve as our campsite. It was a wide, flat area, formed naturally by a curve in the subterranean stream. It was only about 8 p.m. that I knew from experience that getting 20 campers fed and bedded down would take at least 2 more hours. I kept an eye out for the shadowy figure or the phantom red lights, but there was no sign of anything strange while we all unpacked. When the campers had finished eating and we were getting ready for lights out, Miriam approached me. I wanted to ask you earlier, have you noticed another caver around? My blood ran cold. Miriam went on without waiting for a response. It's just strange that someone would be in here this late. Someone other than a few loud local teenagers, and whoever they are, why wouldn't they be using any light? To be honest, I hesitated. I got a bad feeling about this. Should we, call it off? I silently prayed that she'd say yes. Everything about this trip was wrong. Wrong like those eerie graffiti faces spray-painted on the walls. Wrong like the rusted Civil War-era bone saw we'd passed near the entrance. Wrong like the abandoned veins of precious metal that led downward into the dark. Miriam shook her head. Do you want to explain to Scoutmaster Dan and 20-odd parents why they have to come pick up their kids at 1 a.m. on a weeknight? Because that's what will happen. Assuming we get them all out of here on no sleep, it was just one working radio. She had a point. Whoever, or whatever, was out there. It hadn't made any hostile signs towards us so far, so ignoring it and hoping it would go away wasn't the best option. It reeked of helplessness and desperation, but I couldn't think of anything else to do. The campers' muffled laughter and whispered conversation suddenly sounded sinister. As I performed the final bed check, I kept expecting to find one camper's sleeping bag ripped to shreds or squirming as some monstrous, unnameable thing with too many legs came bursting out. Despite my fears, all 20 campers were present and accounted for. After a long day of caving, even Alex, Kyle, and Sean were already fast asleep. Unlike them, I couldn't bring myself to crawl into my sleeping bag or close my eyes. I was too afraid that I'd wake up and find myself being dragged off into the dark. There was no dawn underground, but Miriam and I had our alarms synchronized for 6 a.m. That would give the campers a total of 6 hours to pack up, eat, trek out of the cave, and get cleaned up before their parents arrived to pick them up. The early wake-up met with groans and complaints, but we were used to that. The important thing was to get them moving. After a breakfast of granola bars and sports drinks, we rounded everyone up for the morning head count. 18, 19, 20, 21. That was impossible. I thought for sure I had miscounted, but Miriam's count returned the same result. As I scanned the group for an unfamiliar face, I told Miriam to dig the roster out of her rucksack. She returned moments later, angry, confused, and scared. The roster's gone. So are my spare headlamps and the extra food. It's like a bear went through my pack. I checked my own pack and found it too had been ransacked sometime during the night. I shivered. Whatever had done it would have been just inches from my head, and I hadn't even noticed it. Time was of the essence. We couldn't count on our spare lights any longer. Miriam nodded to the assembled group of 21 campers and whispered, "Are there any faces you don't recognize? Anyone who stands out?" It could have been the pale kid standing at the edge of the group with a blank expression on his face, his shirt buttoned up wrong, his boots unlaced. It could have been the black-haired boy with glasses who'd somehow gotten his arms and legs covered in gray-green cave mud. It could have been the skinny one with a blonde bowl cut who was chomping on his 6th granola bar like a wolf gnawing on a bone. It could have been any of them. In the past weeks, all those preteen faces had started to blend together. I'd been so distracted by everything that had gone wrong that I was no longer sure exactly who I had come into the cave with. The campers, too, didn't seem to notice anything that was amiss, and some instinct screamed at me to keep it that way. We needed to get out of Silverlode Cave, and fast. Ironically, Alex, Kyle, and Sean were the only ones I felt sure of, so I put them right behind me in the line. I knew they wouldn't like that one bit, but I figured they'd do or say something stupid to alert me if some horrible imposter came crawling across the ceiling to slit my throat. The campers were always quiet on their first morning in the cave. Usually it was just the uncanny feeling of waking up in the absolute darkness that did it. But there was something more at work this time. Even the densest of them had seen the fear and confusion on my face. They knew that something was off, and they seemed to realize for the first time that they were dependent on us to get out of there. The goofing off that we'd had to deal with on the trek to Silverlode Cave had been replaced by nervous jitters and whispering. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to turn back to the campers, and began to let us out of Silverlode Cave. One of the first things that Scoutmaster Dan taught us about caving was the importance of pausing occasionally to note the landmarks behind you. Unlike the terrain above ground, a cave can seem completely different when observed from the opposite direction. Even longtime guides like Miriam sometimes experience the gut-plunging feeling of looking around at the twisting passages and realizing that nothing at all looked familiar. It hadn't happened to me, not until we began our journey back that day. As we left the main chamber behind, we reached the first sink, a bend in the creek where the water disappeared, only to reappear further along in the cave. The path should have been to the right, but it wasn't. There was only the creek, disappearing between yet another jagged stone wall. The way to the exit had disappeared. I wanted to believe that I just made a mistake, that what I was seeing was just the result of my own slowly building panic, but Miriam had noticed it too. She kept mumbling under her breath, rummaging in her rucksack for the plastic-coated map that had disappeared along with the rest of her gear. As an experienced guide, she was taking the impossible change a lot harder than I was. She knew it was wrong, and I had a nasty feeling that if she stayed in the chamber much longer, she'd shut down completely. Most caves have more than one way in or out, and Silverlode was no exception. We normally led the campers via the easiest route, the one that followed the stream, but that was apparently no longer an option. The lower passage tended to flood, and even when the water subsided, it left snarls of dead leaves, wood, trash, muck that fed some of the largest insects and spiders I'd ever seen. I didn't like the odds of getting the campers through the mess, so I opted for the alternative route, through the upper galleries. I tried to swallow, but my throat was dry with cave dust. "All right, campers," I grimaced. "We're gonna take a little detour." It was tougher than I remembered. The tunnel grew so narrow that the stone walls scraped against my shoulders. The rough ceiling so low that I occasionally felt the long, alien legs of a cave cricket as it skittered through my hair. These upper passages had a nasty slope. While crawling along them, you were constantly sliding down to the right towards a jagged black crevice that, to the best of my knowledge, had never been explored. It wasn't wide enough to fall into, not even for the skinniest of campers, but it was unsettling. I couldn't shake the fear that it It might suddenly begin to expand like a grinning, toothless mouth that swallows whole, or that some unspeakable horror might come slithering out of its lightless depths. I looked back at the campers, their faces flushed with effort, sweaty hair plastered to their foreheads beneath their cheap plastic helmets, and reminded myself that the unspeakable horror was already here among us. But as to what it was or what it wanted, I had no idea. Just an hour left, I reminded myself. An hour and we'd come crawling out into the sunlight, where surely everything would make more sense. It would turn out to be a misunderstanding, a joke, a trick of the mind, born of dark places underground. I was so lost in thought that it took me a moment to realize that we'd reached a dead end. Miriam and the rest of the campers piled in around me, confused by the stone bottleneck that I'd just led us into. This couldn't be happening. I'd been here before. There was a way out. I would have bet my life on it. And maybe I had. One of the most nauseating feelings in caving is the flickering just before a headlamp goes out. I still had some spare batteries in my pocket, but the sudden blackness in front of me was a grim reminder that our time was limited. The campers were getting restless behind me. Some of them were cursing and warning us their parents would sue. Others were whimpering, practically begging me to tell them that things were going to be okay. I wish that I could, but if this didn't work, we wouldn't have the light or the strength to find another way out. Suddenly, Miriam sprang forward and began digging at the rock with her bare hands. As loose stones fell away around her fingers, I realized what must have happened. A rock slide had blocked the narrow passage ahead. A largish boulder had plunged into the tunnel, making it seem to have vanished completely. It took me, Miriam, and 3 of our strongest campers to finally pry the boulder loose. Even after the passage was cleared, the whole thing left me sick to my stomach. It was like something, maybe even the cave itself, had blocked the tunnel on purpose. I would have sworn that the final tunnel was a tighter squeeze than I remembered. Silverlode Cave seemed reluctant to let us go, dragging myself through with one arm, my helmet off to ensure that my head could fit. I had the awful feeling the cave was a living thing with a will of its own, and that it had decided to crush us to death slowly. Something brushed against my face, a root. Up ahead, pale moths fluttered in the beam of my headlight. I'd been too tense to notice it, but the cave had been getting warmer. And I saw it. Sunlight. We were almost free, but all I felt was worry. Why were we being allowed to leave? One by one, we clambered out into the woods. Even the campers were too tired to complain, and in the sun that filtered through the leaves, I could see the tear streaks on their cheeks. Just like Miriam and I, they were filthy, exhausted, and grateful to be alive. I nodded to Miriam as she heaved herself out behind the last camper. It was time to start counting heads again. 18, 19, 20. Miriam's eyes went wide. She shrugged and shook her head, sure that she hadn't missed anyone. Either the mystery camper had disappeared, or one of the others had been replaced. It would have been so easy. All it would have taken is for the headlamps of the nearby campers to look away for a moment. Then there would have been the clatter of falling stones, a sudden movement in the dark, and then, when they looked again, nothing would appear to be different. But what would have happened to the camper who'd been taken? Were they simply murdered and buried beneath the rocks, devoured by whatever monstrous thing had replaced them, or had they slipped through the wall somehow and found themselves alone in another layer of the cave, lost, hungry, and scared, their headlamp batteries running out? We were 4 hours late to the drop-off point. The parents and Scoutmaster Dan were fuming, but I barely registered their anger. I was too busy searching the crowd, waiting to see whether there was one camper who wouldn't be picked up, or one parent searching obsessively for a child whose face they didn't see. But everyone out of our campers went home that day. After the disaster of my first cave tour, I wasn't invited back the next summer session. But I still wonder about what I experienced in Silverlode Cave. Scoutmaster Dan had told us that he'd never lost a camper. But how could he be so sure? Were there some parents out there who had noticed a subtle and inexplicable change in their child after they returned from caving camp? The kind of change that they'd only dared to talk to their partner about late at night. After a few drinks, their child was hopefully asleep. He never was quite the same after he spent the night in that cave, was he? Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and before we get started on tonight's story, I'm going to let you know about Cabinet of Fever Dreams. Cabinet of Fever Dreams is available now on Spotify. It's a new story podcast that is a collection of all stories from Mike Jesus Langer, the author of tonight's story. New episodes on Tuesday, Thursdays, and Sundays. You can find a link to them in the description down below. And now, on to tonight's story. The sign was an improvised marriage of laminated paper and flimsy wood. The plastic was worn at the edges, and the original yellow coloring of the paper had soaked away through untold seasons, but the message of the sign was clear. In bold, Comic Sans font, it read, "Do not feed the midnight clowns." The drive from Olymec to Prague took 3 hours on a good day, and 5 if the D1 was being its usual self. But I always made it without any stops. It was on that particular day, near the tail end of a Sunday afternoon ride, that I felt the need to pull over into the particular gas stations. I got a Red Bull and a baguette, and I sat down at the benches by the parking lot. Getting some caffeine in my system and food in my stomach had me feeling better, and I was still feeling just a bit too sleepy to get back behind the wheel. So, to wake myself up, I went for a bit of a walk around the lot. It was a big place, one of those spots where the long haulers with foreign plates sleep. I walked along the massive trucks carrying mysteries until I reached a slope of gravel. At the bottom of the rocks sat a meadow, and embedded in its unkempt grass, the sign read, "Do not feed the midnight clowns." The first time I had stopped at the gas station was purely by chance, but it quickly became tradition. I was making the drive from Prague to Olymec just about every Friday afternoon, and driving back just about every Sunday. Stopping by the sign became my little ritual at the end of the week. Once, on my third pilgrimage or so, I even ventured to ask the gas station attendant about the sign. They weren't helpful, or nice for that matter. The internet was of no help either. The message was there week after week, yet no new clues to its origin presented themselves. So, as the month dragged on, I just found myself content with the mystery of the sign, which read, "Do not feed the midnight clowns." I was seeing a girl in Olymec. At first, the obstacles of distance seemed completely absurd, but life works better when people are at arm's reach. I thought she'd eventually move to the bigger city, but she liked it back home. She wanted to stay. She worked at a theater and loved the old building in a way that I couldn't comprehend. As we argued more and more about the theater and our diverting future, we started to see each other less. After a couple of missed visits, we texted each other goodbye. Maybe I was just busy with work, or maybe I was too heartbroken to care. But when I stopped going to Olymec, I stopped thinking about the sign. For 3 weeks, I sulked and worked and slept and drank, and then, on a Friday, just as I was getting ready to spend the evening alone, she showed up at my door. A welcome surprise. We had a splendid weekend and parted on good, yet vague terms. Through chat boxes across the week, all seemed fine. We spoke as if the past month apart had been a collective hallucination. When I showed up at her place on Friday, however, time came crashing down on us. She seemed happy to see me at first, but 5 days had passed and they made all the difference. Things got sad. Last week's visit might have been a mistake, but this one definitely was. We sat down at our favorite pub, each nursing a solitary beer as we tried to make sense of the future. When the pauses in conversation got too long to bear, I decided it would be best for me to go back home. I'd scarcely sipped from my beer, but it was already dark. There could be plenty of dangers lurking in the darkness of the D1 highway. She insisted I stay, even if only on the couch. I couldn't. There were 2 stops I took on my drive back home. The first, not far from Olympic, was at a roadside McDonald's. My nerves kept me from eating the whole day, and as I sat in the parking lot by the Golden Arches, they kept me unhungry still. I took a couple tasteless bites of my burger before I got back on the road. In the darkness and silence, I drove back home, resolved to stop at a familiar parking lot with a makeshift sign. No truckers slept that night. The parking lot, much like the gas station, was empty. I didn't mind the solitude, though. Parking back in my usual spot after a month-long break brought up plenty of feelings. And on the back of those feelings, my hunger returned. I ate my now cold McDonald's with only flashes of the headlights from the highway for company. I got through the burger, but by the time I ate my first nugget, I was wiping my fingers and checking my phone. She hadn't called. And she hadn't written. It was just a couple minutes after midnight. Did I notice the bobbing red lights on the far side of the parking lot? At first, I thought it was just the reflections of the passing cars, yet even when the road was empty, the small blip of red continued to hover in the darkness. For a while, I sat there trying to uncover the mystery of the light from the comfort of my own car. I ate my cold McNuggets and watched. Finally, when only stale fries and a paper bag remained, I got out of the car. The walk to the edge of the parking lot wasn't far, yet the closer I got, the more my steps slowed. At first, the bobbing red light was just that, a featureless glow in the darkness. The closer I got, however, the more my steps started to slow. The red light was starting to resemble the nose of a clown. I never took the concept of the midnight clowns seriously. I always considered the sign in the meadow to be the result of some inside joke or quirky artistry. Looking at that bobbing red light, however, had me questioning my skepticism. A flash of light from a passing car dispelled any doubt. I saw him only for a second, but the afterburn of the bizarre image lingered in the darkness. The red light was a glowing clown nose attached to a pale face with frizzled hair. In the darkness, there was a clown, and he was balancing on stilts. The sight made me doubt my sanity, and I was uncomfortable enough to consider retreating to my car. But just as I was about to turn around and run, I heard the queerest of sounds. I lack the words to fully describe it, but it was like a mixture of whistling and children's laughter, a strange song which lacked any melody or tempo. It was coming ever so faintly from the far side of the parking lot. The clown on the stilts had made me beyond uncomfortable, but there was something about that queer song that filled my heart with calm. And perhaps it was just out of curiosity, or perhaps it was the thought of going back home to my empty apartment that made me sick. I decided to investigate the strange music. The sign had not changed, yet it no longer seemed absurd. At the bottom of the slope of gravel, all around the lowly meadow, frolicked the midnight clowns. There were about a dozen of them, all different shapes and sizes, all dancing and twirling and enjoying the night. Their eyes shone with a calm pale blue, and their noses, much like the one of the stilt walker, lit up in bright blood red. I stood not far from the clowns in plain sight, yet none of them acknowledged me. Their song, although unconventional in its composition, seemed friendly, and the way they danced and rolled around the meadow didn't make the clowns seem dangerous, but I knew better than to spend my evenings with strangers in unlit wilderness, making as little noise as I could. I retreated back into my car. The absurdity of what I had seen, although seemingly harmless, had become far too much to handle on my own. The moment I got back in my car, almost by instinct, I called her. I told her about the sign and the clowns, but even in the moment, the wild strangers in the meadow seemed less pressing than our relationship. We talked. We talked for a long time, and as we talked, I fished out my stale French fries from the McDonald's bag and picked away at them, and the words I wanted to say got stuck in my throat. We talked, and as we talked, my attention drifted from the bobbing red lights in the distance. It wasn't until we said our final goodbyes and hung up that I noticed that the sole clown nose was no longer alone. Like bloody fireflies, the crowd of clowns approached my car from the far side of the parking lot. They hopped and danced and did cartwheels in my directions, all while producing the eerie notes of that strange song. They moved quick, and by the time I got the motor running, the clowns had surrounded my car. With long, thin fingers, they pressed against my window, and with shining, starving eyes, they looked at my half-empty pack of French fries. The midnight clowns were discomforting from the very start, but it wasn't until they had their faces pressed against the windshield of my car that I felt true terror. They had the faces of children. Even though some of them had scraggly beards and most seemed to possess the bodies of full-grown adults, all the clowns had the innocent faces of children. Their teeth, however, exuded a wholly different mood. Like thin, writhing tentacles, they moved around their small mouths. The longer the strange creatures looked at my pack of French fries, the more bits of glowing red spittle slid down their childish chins. The midnight clowns watched my food, and with their strange, writhing dentures, they licked at their thin lips. Before the creatures could fully surround my car, I got in reverse and hightailed as far away from the parking lot as I could. As hungry as the clowns were, and as quickly as they moved before, they did not make chase. For a couple panicked moments, I could see the stilt-walking clown in my rearview mirror, but even he soon disappeared. I got away safely. And when I was still in that parking lot, a strange thought swirled through my mind. I considered, very briefly, feeding the midnight clowns. They did, after all, look very hungry, and there was something about that strange music that escaped their lips that had me feeling charitable about my cold McDonald's. I don't know if the idea to feed the clowns came out of my very own will, or whether they had somehow forced the thought into my skull through their queer dances and music. Regardless of how the idea of sharing my food grasped my consciousness, however, I rejected it. I rejected it because I remembered the sign. I remembered the makeshift sign in an inconspicuous meadow that provided a single line of advice. I remembered the sign that read, ever so clearly, "Do not feed the midnight clowns." I knew that going to the laundromat at 2 a.m. was a bad idea, but I didn't have a choice. In less than 6 hours, I had to be at work, and I still hadn't eaten dinner. The half-unpacked remains of my move lay scattered around the cramped studio apartment, and that was how disaster struck. In slow motion, I watched it happen. My neatly pressed work uniform hanging from a chair in the kitchen, the boiling pot of pasta and the open jar of tomato sauce beside it, my fluffy golden cat Waffles gently nudging the jar towards the end of the counter with a single sadistic paw. "Waffles, no!" I shouted. Too late. The jar shattered on the floor. The kitchen and my work uniform now looked like movie props from an 80s slasher flick. Waffles, his eyes wide as though the chaos had been caused by some other cat, scurried off to hide under the bed. I hung my head and turned the spaghetti pot off. Everything else that had just happened to me lately, and now this. I was starting a new job and living out of my suitcase on the seedy side of town because of a messy breakup with my now ex-boyfriend, Nate. Just 3 days before, I was starting over from nothing. I really needed this job. I couldn't afford to show up covered in tomato sauce stains on my first day. So cursing, I stuffed the crimson-spattered clothing into a laundry bag and trudged downstairs. It just stopped raining. The late-night streets were completely deserted. I didn't know the neighborhood well at all, but I remembered seeing a 24-hour laundromat just 2 blocks up from my dingy apartment building. So sure enough, I could see the reflection of its neon sign on the rain-slicked streets ahead. I took a deep breath. Maybe things would be okay after all. So, hitching the bag higher on my shoulder, I headed towards the laundromat's glow. The cool night air felt good on my skin. Change rattled cheerfully in my pocket. So, why was I so nervous? It might have been the neighborhood, which had a reputation for danger, especially for women, and especially at night. My friends had practically staged an intervention when I told them where I was moving, but the truth was that I didn't have a choice. I needed a place with cheap rent where the landlords didn't ask too many questions, and this was it. By coming here, I'd put half the city between me and my ex-boyfriend, and that was all I cared about. It was just the sinister memories of news articles that I'd read about those seamy streets that had me so on edge, or was it something more? Every instinct screamed danger, but I couldn't see its source in the lightless windows around me. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, but every time I turned around, the inky black streets seemed empty. I pushed open the door to the laundromat. Something clanged above me, bringing a scream to my throat, but when I looked up, I couldn't help but laugh. It was just the jingle of the bell above the door. The laundromat was bright, modern, and surprisingly clean. Industrial-strength washers and dryers lined the walls. Beside the door was a row of plastic seats, an out-of-order vending machine, and a small table stacked high with outdated newspapers and magazines. I just inserted my coins and started the wash cycle when the bell above the door sounded for a second time. My blood ran cold. Before I could turn around, a harsh masculine voice spoke right behind me. "Looks like you murdered someone." "What?" I spun, wondering how the lanky figure had crossed the room so quickly. The awareness that he stood between me and the door made my heart beat a little faster. "Your clothes, the red stains, who'd you kill?" His mouth twisted into a yellow jack-o'-lantern grin as he repeated his ghastly joke. He was too close. Way too close. My nose was practically touching his chest. He gave off a foul odor like a rot in a dark place. Black dirt was caked beneath his fingernails. For some reason, that tiny observation was what terrified me most of all. What was this guy doing in a laundromat at 2:30 a.m.? And why didn't he have any clothes to wash? "It's spaghetti sauce," I murmured finally, and tried to pass by him. "Whoa, not so fast!" The man deftly blocked my path. "Are you seriously going to act like you don't remember me?" I took him in. Ripped jeans, paint-splattered black t-shirt, gangly arms covered with what looked like track marks, tangled, greasy black hair. I'd never seen him before in my life. The door of the laundromat felt hopelessly far away. "I think you're confusing me with someone else." I tried to sidestep again, but he was just too quick. "Seriously?" he repeated, sounding almost disappointed. "That name's Samuel. It doesn't ring any bells, huh?" "Look, I don't know you. You're just standing in my way." I hated how scared and shrill my voice was. "I'm leaving now, so..." "I'm afraid I can't let you do that." Only then did I notice the knife glinting in Samuel's hand. My eyes darted to the black windows, the empty street outside. There was no one to save me, no one to call for help. I shut my eyes tightly. If only I hadn't left that jar of pasta on the edge of the counter. If only I'd hung my work uniform up somewhere else. Everything could have been different. My bad decisions marched through my mind one after another like a grim parade. Run away from my ex without a solid plan, moving to a dangerous neighborhood out of desperation, not just trying to wash out the damn stain at home. I blinked. Samuel hadn't stabbed me, grabbed me, or hurt me yet. I suppose you're wondering what I'm doing here, my hostage-taker mused. The only thing I was wondering was how to either get his knife or get away from him. But I kept my mouth shut and let him talk. I read somewhere that it was a bad move to interrupt a psychopath's monologue, and that certainly seemed to be the case here. But I could ask you something, couldn't I? Samuel rambled on. Why are you in a laundromat at 2:30 a.m.? I don't just mean the tomato sauce stains. I really want you to ask yourself, what are you doing here? The question caught me off guard. My eyes drifted once again to the knife. I could imagine all too clearly the gruesome possibilities of what might happen if Samuel didn't like my response. You don't have to answer out loud if you don't want to. Just think about it. Now, why don't you have a seat? It's going to be a while before that uniform gets clean, B. I was halfway to the chairs when I realized with shock what Samuel had called me. Back in elementary school, B had been my nickname, a tribute to the first letter of my real name, and to my obsession with a certain pollinating insect, but no one had called me that in years. Who was this guy? Don't try anything stupid, Samuel informed me as he took a seat between me and the exit. I don't want you to get hurt. It was an odd way of phrasing it, considering he was the one with the knife. Once he'd said his piece, however, Samuel leaned back in the plastic chair, as still and silent as a corpse. With nothing better to do, while my laundry spun and Samuel stared blankly into space, I ruminated on my kidnapper's question. What was I doing here, really? It had started with something simple. A fight over nothing. My boyfriend Nate and I had been arguing about whose turn it was to wash the dishes when he suddenly slapped me with the back of his hand. For a moment, I was stunned. I couldn't believe what had just happened. Even harder to believe was the savage look of victory and satisfaction on his face. Nate had always been so calm and gentle. Of all the people I dated, I'd never once imagined that he would be the one who hit me. But I wasn't going to stand for it. My mother had an abusive partner for almost a year when I was a child, and after seeing what she'd gone through, I'd sworn to myself that the moment a romantic partner lifted a hand against me, it was over. I started packing right away, completely deaf to my boyfriend's apologies and pleas. He hadn't meant it, and he was sorry, and it would never happen again. Listening to him, I'd had an eerie sensation that my mom's ex-partner was speaking through his lips, as though he was a medium channeling that awful man's ghost. The impact of his knuckles was still burning on my cheek when I climbed into the idling taxi. I had nothing in the world except for 4 suitcases, the small savings account, and my cat Waffles purring in my lap. I went no contact, blocking Nate's number and refusing to speak to him again, even after I realized that I'd forgotten my laptop at his place. As far as I was concerned, he could have it, along with anything else that I'd left behind. It was the price that I paid for freedom. Tears welled up in my eyes as I glanced at the grim figure in the seat beside me. With his hollow-eyed stare and razor-sharp hunting knife, how had my life come to this? Had I been too stubborn, too headstrong? I hadn't wanted to ask anyone for help, not even my family and friends. I'd been too embarrassed by how badly I'd misjudged Nate. If I was honest with myself, that was the true answer to my captor's question. My own reckless choices were what had led me to a 24-hour laundromat on a savage side of town in the early hours of the morning. I hung my head. Far across the tile floor, the washing machine beeped, and Samuel's filthy fingers squeezed my shoulder. I winced. His grip was cold and hard. Your laundry's done, B. As I carried my damp uniform to the dryer, I wondered what time it was. 3:30? 4? In a few hours, the sky would begin to brighten and there would be people on the streets again. I'd finally have a chance to get away from this psycho. If I lived that long. With a shiver, I realized that Samuel had to be just aware of the passage of time as I was. Whatever he had planned for me, it was going to happen soon. Maybe even as soon as the dry cycle was finished. Yet Samuel stared dead ahead, the knife resting steadily on the thigh of his jeans. That same crooked smile on his gaunt face. He was as still as a cobra waiting to strike. Not even his expression had changed. We watched my clothing spin in silence. When the machine finally beeped, the shock of it made me jump in my chair. This was it. Trying not to look at my captor or his weapon, I loaded my still warm uniform into my dryer bag and headed for the door. If I didn't say anything, if I acted like all this was normal, maybe he'd let me go. As if in a dream, I felt the door handle in my hand and heard the jingle of the bell overhead as I pushed it. Samuel still hadn't moved. "Take care of yourself, B," was all he said as I walked out the door. I couldn't believe it. I wanted to kiss the filthy, uneven sidewalk beneath my feet. The nightmare was over. I was almost to my apartment when I heard sprinting footsteps charging towards me. Of course, it had been too good to be true. I knew I should have run, but I froze instead, eyes shut tight, waiting for the inevitable. It never came. Instead, I heard a faint gasp and a dull thud of something heavy hitting the pavement. When I finally dared to turn around, I saw Nate lying in a puddle of blood. A wire was tangled in his hands. His face was twisted in an expression of mindless hate. Of Samuel, there wasn't a trace apart from the hunting knife, buried up to the hilt in Nate's chest. It took me days to recover, and days more to piece together what had happened. Although I'd changed my password after leaving Nate, I hadn't considered that my phone tracking app was still open on the laptop that I'd left behind. It could be used to find my phone, to find me. That part of the night, at least. It made sense. But who was Samuel? Where had he come from? How had he seemed to know me so well? Against my better judgment, I returned to the laundromat at 2:30 a.m. the next night. I couldn't have said why. Maybe I wanted to thank Samuel, or maybe I just needed to confirm for myself that he'd even been real. The police had cleared me from any involvement in Nate's death, but so many unanswered questions still swirled around me. I wanted closure. I wanted to know what had really happened that night. I hardly dared to breathe as I peered into the window of the 24-hour laundromat, only to find it empty. I wasn't sure if I was relieved or disappointed. Retracing my steps, I searched for any clue about who Samuel had been. I found what I was looking for on the table of magazines in the laundromat. Flipping through a month-old newspaper, I found a small article caught my attention. "Another local youth claimed by drugs," read the title, followed by 2 photos. One showed a cleaner, smiling Samuel, and the other sent a flood of memories coursing through me. Sammy. The gap-toothed boy with a bowl cut who'd been my partner in crime back in 3rd grade. I hadn't thought about him in years, and I'd never have imagined seeing him again in a place like this under such bizarre circumstances. Sammy was Samuel. Addiction had clearly taken its toll on the boy I once knew, but the 2 photos were clearly the same person. According to the article, he had died of a heroin overdose just a few blocks away from the new apartment. His body had been found over a month ago. But in that case, who or what had stabbed Nate? I didn't have an explanation then. I still don't. But every time I hear the bell of my local laundromat ring, I turn around, hoping to see a familiar face. Last night, I decided to take my dog for a walk. I had a pair of cheap but surprisingly comfortable sandals that I've been wearing wherever I go out, grab the mail, walk my dog, anything that doesn't require me to travel on foot for long. On the way back home after what had been a long but uneventful walk through the neighborhood, I was suddenly approached by a man on the sidewalk who, without introduction, commented that I had very refined set of feet. Unsure of what exactly that meant, and immediately creeped out, more so by this sudden appearance than the comment itself. I meekly thanked him, and I hurried my dog towards my house. I didn't look back, fearing the man would take my glance as an invitation to follow. I probably shouldn't have gone straight home, but it was late. I was tired. I heard no footsteps trailing my own, and I entered my house without further contact. The next day I found a letter on my front porch. The contents of that letter were unaltered. I am the man who you met on the street last night. If you remember, I remarked that you had quite an impeccable pair of feet. I'm willing to offer you $1,200 per hour if you allow me to study them. There will be no physical contact during this session, and you are free to leave at any time before the hour and still receive the full amount. But I assure you that there will be nothing unusual or strange about the session, aside from, of course, the unusual nature of the request itself. I merely wish to study, measure, and photograph your feet. All from a distance, of course. If you would be interested, please call me at this number. Having just been unceremoniously demoted at work, so as to allow my boss's son a managerial position, nepotism strikes again. I decided that I could tolerate being photographed and studied for an hour, if it resulted in leaving with $1,200 in my pocket. I called the number, received directions to a house in a much nicer neighborhood than my own, and drove out to meet the man for the session. His house was plainly, innocently furnished, and I tried to suppress, or at least ignore, the thoughts like, all serial killers have normal-looking houses. The man showed me to his sunlit living room, not a dimly lit basement, a pleasant surprise, where he'd set up a camera and recording equipment, and one of those really expensive massage chairs that used to aggressively advertise at malls. I was directed to sit, offered a beverage, which I of course declined, and at his prompting, I removed my shoes and socks. I sat for about 15 minutes, browsing random forums on my phone, while the man took countless pictures of my bare feet. He was very focused throughout the session, only speaking to instruct me on positioning and angles. He took down notes in a spiral-bound notebook, but I could only make out the occasional word. Sentences and phrases were written in some strange language I didn't recognize. Aside from the somewhat odd color scheme of his outfit, dark brown khakis, shorts, and a purple t-shirt that had to be at least a decade old, he looked normal enough. And I assumed that the usage of a foreign language was for an added layer of privacy, an understandable precaution considering the subject matter. And as he promised in his note, the man did not touch me, merely gestured in the directions he wanted me to move my feet. There was the expected excitement in his eyes, which I admittedly, it did make me feel a bit nice. Seeing someone so apparently enamored with me, even though the object of their fascination were my feet. But there was also consternation in his face, or perhaps frustration, an expression not dissimilar to what you might see on the face of a student trying to solve a difficult problem. The last 10 minutes of the session were spent questioning me on my ambulatory habits. He asked about the kind of footwear I usually wore, where I usually walked, and for how long, and other somewhat strange, slightly scientific inquiries, but nothing sexual. His focus actually seemed more like that of a doctor than a fetishist. Before I could answer a question concerning my preference of sock length, white, nothing past the ankle, thank you very much, A timer went off, and he shut his notebook with a sigh. He then stood up, he'd been kneeling before me, and withdrew a stuffed envelope from his pocket. He handed it to me and began shutting off his equipment. I would have pocketed the envelope, trusting by the size alone that it contained $1,200, but he insisted that I count it, presumably to cement a trust that he'd probably later use to encourage me to schedule subsequent sessions. As I counted the money, divided into crisp $50 bills, I casually remarked, "You must really like feet, huh?" The man stopped mid-motion, his hands suspended over a light. He turned to face me, and I saw a new expression on his face, an expression of unrestrained revulsion. He carefully stepped around the equipment he had yet to put away, went to a tall bookcase against a nearby wall, and immediately pushed it aside, revealing an alcove in the wall. In the alcove, resting on the 3 different shelves, were 3 large jars filled with some kind of translucent green liquid. And floating within these jars were fleshy parts and pieces, apparently hewn off some larger creature. Despite seemingly belonging to different species, there was a morphological commonness about the objects. They were all, I realized with a heart-pausing horror, rudimentarily grown or abnormally developed. I do not like feet. It's just the opposite. They disgust me. But if I am to remain here, I am to blend in. Then I must study and duplicate them. And you can see by the rest of my flawless appearance, they are the one aspect of human anatomy that I have yet to accurately, comfortably replicate. I've otherwise achieved perfect mimicry in all other aspects of human anatomy and physiology. Stepping away from the shelves, but leaving them uncovered, he placed one of his feet on a nearby coffee table and carefully unfastened the laces of his shoes. I remember finding it odd that he'd kept them on while within the home, but knew that some people walked around their house with their shoes on, so I hadn't said anything. When the laces were undone, he removed the shoe. Instead of a sock-covered foot beneath, there was a heavily bandaged mass, roughly in the shape of a foot, bearing several extensions and lumps that I knew were failed toe formations. But I was unfortunately not spared the uncertainty of the speculation. He quickly unwound the bandages through which some sickening yellow excretions had seeped, until a disgusting sallow-skinned appendage was revealed. The would-be foot, the failed ambulatory extremity, had 6 of the malformed toes, 2 lumps on the topmost surface, 1 in the front where they'd ordinarily be, while the rest rimmed the abominable mass. Above the foot, instead of a seamless transition into the ankle, there was a revolting disparity in the tones of his skin. I screamed and I recoiled away from the sight, nearly knocking over the camera's tripod. The man quickly reapplied the bandages, not bothering to replace the soiled wraps with fresh ones, and put his shoe back on. He remarked almost absent-mindedly that foot was the better one. The other was, quote, in a much worse state. Truly a travesty of design. I scrambled to my still bare feet, back against the wall, certain that I'd have to fight for my life now that I'd been shown his terrible, sickening secret. But the man went to his shelves, gazed solemnly into the jars therein for a moment, then returned the bookcase to its former position, hiding the severed jar-suspended parts from sight. He then went back to tidying up his workspace, not at all surprised by the cowering foot model in the other side of the room. When he completely packed up his equipment, he brought it all into another room, and then quickly returned with a steaming cup in his hand. He sipped, smiled in satisfaction, then looked at me with a raised brow expression which plainly asked, "Oh, you're still here?" Dumbfounded by the casualness of the last few minutes, I asked, Am I allowed to go?" He nodded, this time smiling at what might have to him sounded like an absurd question. I tried to regain some of my composure, but I was a bit embarrassed by my somewhat dramatic but still justified reaction to the horrific things that he'd presented to me. I awkwardly put my shoes back on, while the man continued to sip from his cup and stroll around his living room. My nerves still buzzed, the shock and terror of the encounter not yet diluted by the apparent harmlessness of the mutated footman. I took one last glance at the man, making sure that he had not primed himself to assault me when I turned my back, but he'd seated himself in the chair that I'd been sitting in, his legs propped up on the extendable footrest that I hadn't known was there. He smiled, and I returned the expression, and I went to leave. When I gripped the knob of the front door, the man called out behind me, "Feel free to give me a call if you ever like to let me study again. I'd be more than happy to provide the same rate of payment. I'd even be willing to throw in a bit extra if you could return within the week. Once I perfectly replicated the human foot, I could finally begin my plan. Trust me, you'll definitely want all the money you can get your hands on so you can distance yourself as far away from here as possible. Oh, yeah. You won't want to be here. Not anywhere near here." So I closed the door behind me. I heard a loud and eerily inhuman laugh issue from within the house. The tones almost bestial in modulation, and carrying a sonic weight that made them clearly heard despite the distance and physical barriers between us. As I walked away from the house, the laugh seemed to follow me, only dying out when I rounded a corner. And even then, in those last few moments, it felt as if the undeniable, inhuman voice took on a harsher, even more sinister pitch. A maniacal alien shriek that caused a nearby flock of birds to briefly disband, scattering wildly in their animalistic terror. Regardless of this last, admittedly monstrous revelation, I think I'll be back before the end of the week. And then, once I have enough money, I'll probably go on an extended vacation. Jeffrey hated jack-o'-lanterns. This was a problem since his hometown was known as the jack-o'-lantern capital of the United States. Every year, the town was host to thousands, if not millions, of carved horrors. It had become a point of pride for the small Midwestern town. The town had been full of pumpkins since it was founded back in the 1800s, and the town was filled with glowing, grinning gourds from September till April. The public commons had 3 large greenhouses that grew pumpkins during the cold months, and no citizen had to pay for a pumpkin. Jeffrey was pretty sure that it had come out of their taxes, along with road work and the police force. Jeffrey had grown up carving, eating, and hating pumpkins with a red-hot fury. As a child, the glowing gourds had frightened him. His parents were never sure why, but he was terrified of them. Until he was 7, Jeffrey had refused to even carve one, and he remembered getting in trouble several times for pushing them off the front porch. It never stopped the new one from appearing where the old one had been, but they always came with a stern talking to about wasting pumpkins. Pumpkins were a hot commodity in the town, and were not something to be squandered. By the time he was 17, his fear had turned into a deep hatred. A hatred that had brought him to this moment. Jeffrey was sitting on the commons with his friends when he got an idea. Hey, what if you pulled a prank on Halloween? Like, a big prank. Chris looked up, cigarette smoke curling over his face, while Kevin leaned over his handlebars and grinned stupidly at Jeffrey. "What kind of prank?" asked Chris, the cigarette hanging from his mouth like a modern-day cowboy. Jeffrey was your typical greasy teenage troublemaker. He was decked out in a leather jacket, ripped jeans, and black boots, and a constant need to smoke the cigarettes he usually lifted from his dad. Chris likely believed himself to be some kind of badass, and Jeffrey had seen him make good on many of the less-than-ideal threats Chris often made. Chris was also the most stable of Jeffrey's friends, and he made quite the contrast to the grinning idiot leaning on his handlebars. Something big. Something that will never be forgotten, Jeffrey said, grinning hugely. Jeffrey was watching them unload a wagon of pumpkins from the greenhouse as they loitered on the commons. Jeffrey wanted nothing so much as to watch them all become compost. Maybe some soap in the fountain again? Kevin suggested. Kevin was the polar opposite of Chris. If Chris looked like a greaser, Kevin looked like a generic Chad. Blonde hair, blue eyes, tap-out shirt, gold chain, wind pants, a lot of pictures on his phone of his well-crafted physique. Kevin and Chris had been Jeffrey's friends for a long time, but the truth was that he mostly just used them as muscle. He wanted them in on this in case things went south, and something like this had the potential to go very wrong very quickly. No, Kevin, something a little bigger this time. I'm thinking about smashing some pumpkins on Halloween night. Kevin grinned, but Chris raised a piercing eyebrow at him. Are you kidding? You know how anal this town is about those damn pumpkins? If we go around people's houses and smash up their jack-o'-lanterns, I'm not talking about the ones at people's houses. I want to smash all the pumpkins. The ones at the houses, the shops, and the display on the commons, too. The two of them looked at him in stunned silence. By morning, I don't want a single jack-o'-lantern in the whole town unpulped. Kevin grinned like a shot fox, nodding his head and raising his hand for a high five. Jeffrey obliged him, holding his hand up to Chris next. Chris didn't say anything, though. His lips were slowly creeping into a distinctively evil grin as he thought over the implications, and he slapped his own palm against Jeffrey's. Chris was smart, probably smarter than anyone Jeffrey knew, but he loved a good trick as much as anyone. The idea of all the townspeople seeing their pumpkins smashed, their town pride destroyed, made him feel like the Grinch at the end of the movie, sans the change of heart. We'll be legends, more than legends, we'll be infamous, Chris said as he pulled his hand into a raised fist. Jeffrey laughed. Boys, I guarantee that the day after Halloween will go down in history when we're done. As they sat on the commons and started to flesh out their plans, Jeffrey had no idea how right he was. They stood in Jeffrey's garage later that day and made plans. Halloween was 5 days away, and they had to make sure they could commit their prank and get away with it unscathed. Being arrested for a stunt like that would only elevate their street cred, but Jeffrey was honestly a little worried about how the town would take what they were getting ready to do. As the three rode their bikes towards Jeffrey's house, they had passed through downtown and saw the shops littered with pumpkins. The plaque that commemorated when the world's largest pumpkin had come through with their fair one year showed resplendently on the front of the town hall. The display tables of pumpkins outside the Jack-o'-lantern museum made the tables sag under their orange mass. Jeffrey thought again about how vital the stupid things were to the town. They could get in real trouble for this. So the first order of business would be masks. They need to be full face masks, too, Chris put in when Jeffrey brought it up. I don't want them to see our hair or our noses and identify us somehow. Kevin laughed. Easy, my bro and I are heading to Seaver Friday night. You guys slide me some cash for masks, I'll bring back some quality stuff. Jeffrey looked at Chris, and he looked back at him. This was a big ask from Kevin, a guy who still got lost on his way to school sometimes. Kevin's role in the gang was muscle, that was obvious, and trusting him with something like this was a stretch. If he got distracted when he and his bro got to Seaver, they could be out of money and have no masks for this caper. Chris was right when he said that full face masks would be a must, and the shops in town wouldn't have what they were looking for. Kevin must have noticed the look because he got a little flustered. Oh, come on, guys, I can do this. Do you want good masks or not? Chris shrugged at Jeffrey, who sighed as he took out his wallet and handed Kevin 20. Kevin looked at Chris, opening and closing his hand as he crumpled Jeffrey's 20 with each grip. Chris dropped his motorcycle boots off the table and rolled his eyes, pulling a 20 out of his pocket and adding it to the pile. Kevin reached into his wind pants and took out a 20 of his own, adding it to the pile before pushing the whole wad into his pocket. They were taking a big chance on Kevin, and both made sure he damn well knew it. The next 5 days were agony for Jeffrey. He couldn't tell anyone what they were planning to do. That would ruin the prank, but they still had to make sure that they had an alibi. Providence threw them a bone on that one because their friend Mark was having a Halloween party that night. One RSVP later, and they made the party part of their plans. People would see them, they would remember that they had been there, and Jeffrey and his friends could sneak out at 9:30 and be back before any of the booze-soaked brains at the party had time to miss them. It was the perfect plan, and promised to give the boys maximum deniability if questioned. Even so, Jeffrey didn't sleep well that week. He was plagued with dreams. Dreams that he would stagger awake from, and then fall back into as soon as he closed his eyes. Jeffrey saw himself smashing jack-o'-lantern after jack-o'-lantern, a deep fog surrounding everything as he moved from gourd to gourd. All the while, something watched him from that haze. Jeffrey couldn't see it, but it was big. Its red eyes seemed pleased by what he was doing. Now and again, Jeffrey would raise his bat to salute to the mysterious figure, then it would rear back and cackle like a demon. These dreams terrified him, but Jeffrey always woke up feeling elated at the regard of this creature. The three seemed to plan constantly that week. They would use their bikes as transportation. Jeffrey figured they could cut around on their bikes with less notice than a car, and they'd be faster than moving on foot. Jeffrey figured that they would have about an hour and a half to pull this off before the devastation was noticed, and speed would be critical to the operation. Kevin had some baseball bats in his shed they planned to use, and the three began to map their route. As long as Kevin got their masks, they'd be home free. He winked at them Friday afternoon as his brother came to pick him up from school. "Don't forget," Jeffrey reminded him. "I've got this, guys," Kevin scoffed, hopping into the Jeep as the two peeled off for Seaver. Chris and Jeffrey parted ways then, hoping against hope that they would have the last piece of their puzzle soon. Chris sent him a text later that night saying, "Still haven't heard from Kevin." Jeffrey sighed as he buried his face against the pillow. Kevin better not have messed this up. Chris came over the following day and found Jeffrey in the garage. He was oiling the chain on his bike when Chris pulled up. He was preparing for tonight. And Chris looked put out. Jeffrey could guess the source of his anger. Kevin had been radio silent since yesterday after school. Not a text, not a call, nothing. He forgot. He forgot, and you know it, Chris said. "We don't know that yet," Jeffrey said, trying to remain positive. Though brilliant, Chris could be volatile and was prone to moodiness sometimes. Jeffrey didn't want him bailing out at the last minute. "Won't return my texts. His phone goes straight to voicemail. If he and his brother spend the night in Seaver, we could be screwed." Jeffrey started to speak, but at that moment a familiar Jeep pulled up in his driveway. Kevin leaned in to say something to his brother, taking a brown paper sack from the back seat as the Jeep drove off and Kevin approached the pair. He was all smiles, not reading the room at all. And as Chris walked toward him, he spread his arms as he prepared to wrap him in one of his annoying bro hugs when Chris socked him in the gut instead. Kevin's grin faded as he groaned and fell to his knees. Jeffrey pulled him back up, but Kevin took it in stride as Jeffrey tried to pull the greaser away from him. "What was that for?" Kevin gasped, not really hurt, but definitely startled. "That's for bugging out and going radio silent for the last 24 hours. I dropped my phone in a puddle about 5 minutes after we got there. I didn't realize you two were so worried about me." Chris balled up his fist, straining against Jeffrey as he tried to hit Kevin again. Jeffrey pushed the greaser into a nearby recliner, kicking up a cloud of dust as he tried to settle him. "No worries, as long as you got the masks," Jeffrey said, still not holding out hope for the scratch-brained musclehead. Kevin's grin threatened to cut his head in half. "Oh, I got the masks. Think you're gonna find them very fitting, too." Jeffrey took the bag from Kevin, feeling the thick rubber masks inside the plain gray grocery bag. He reached in and pulled out a ghoulish orange mask that made him grin as wide as Kevin. The plastic thing looked like a demented jack-o'-lantern, its gaping black mouth cut into a frightening double row of teeth. Its black eyes were angled with malice, and Jeffrey could see a big plastic roach crawling from its nostril as he took it in. It was perfect. Jeffrey couldn't believe that Kevin had picked this out. It'd be fitting to attack the town's established idols with their very likeness adorning their faces. He tossed a second mask to Chris, and the greaser goggled at the ghoulish thing as he grinned like a fool. Jeffrey could feel a lot of anxiety melt away, and when he raised his hand this time, it was to give Kevin a hearty high five. "Kev, these are perfect. Act like I'd bring back anything less," Kevin said with no small amount of swagger. Jeffrey pulled the mask on, feeling the plastic sit on his face like a second skin. Tonight, we're gonna make history. As the sun began to set and the trick-or-treaters started to gather on the sidewalk, the three set off on their bikes. They had their bats and masks stored in their backpacks, along with the required 6-packs of beer to get them to the party. They had dressed darkly in black pants and hoodies, and they were prepared to ride the streets like phantoms after dark. They arrived at Mark's party around 7, the festivities already in full swing. It was a typical high school underage drinking party. Lots of people making out in the living room, a collective of smoke clouds around the back or front porch, people dancing around to loud music, and a kitchen that was 5 parts wet bar, 5 parts buffet. Mark's parents were out of town. They always seemed to be out of town, and Mark's house was typically the place where parties happened. The three stood around and sipped warm beer, keeping an eye on their watches. Their nerves turned up to 1,000,000,000. They didn't want to be there too long, just long enough to be noticed. They would say hi to some people from school, play a few rounds of beer pong, and at 9:45, they'd slip out and take their bikes off quietly. They had been going over their individual routes for days. Chris would take 1st through 6th Street, Kevin would take 7th through 10th, and Jeffrey would take 11th through 15th. There were roughly 5 to 10 houses per street, and everyone would meet up downtown when they were done. If everyone got done early, they would start smashing pumpkins downtown and wait for the others. If the cops came, they would run. The person discovered would lead them away so the others could keep smashing and then meet back up when they lost the cops. They would not assume the vandals were organized. They would think that they were holiday pranksters out for fun, and if they grabbed one of them, the other two could finish the night's work before anyone was the wiser. When Jeffrey's watch jangled to let them know that it was 9:45, the three of them snuck out the back and rode off into the night. They split off at 10 o'clock. The front porch is dark save for the glow of the jacks, and the streets were mostly free of trick-or-treaters. Jeffrey slipped on his mask as he came to 11th Street, grinning beneath as he pulled his bat from his pack. The first gourd he hit exploded in a shower of orange skin and wet innards. He smiled beneath his mask, smashing the other two and moving on to the next. The pumpkins were old by now, starting to rot, and his bat made quick work of them. Jeffrey had finished with the street in no time, his arm burning from the effort, but his desire for more burning hotter still. He had seen people peeking from their windows, but no blue and whites came to chase him away. The work seemed too easy. The jack-o'-lanterns flew apart with a single swing of the bat, and Jeffrey reveled in the feel of his anger and fear being satiated. He would look back on that feeling throughout the year and feel deep shame. But tonight, it was all about his revenge on the source of his terror. Jeffrey was not challenged until 12th Street. He had gotten cocky halfway through his culling. He wasn't content to just smash the pumpkins anymore, oh no. Jeffrey had started throwing them against trees, mailboxes, and the houses they sat as silent guardians over. No one came out to challenge him, their love for their pumpkins going only so far, and Jeffrey felt untouchable as he shattered his latest gourd against the door of 3608 12th Street. When the man lumbered from beside the porch, laying hands on Jeffrey as the boy grabbed for another pumpkin, Jeffrey was terrified for a half-second. The mask had become turned during his efforts, and he hadn't seen the man as he came sneaking towards him. The light was poor, but Jeffrey was pretty sure it was Mr. Basque, his English teacher. He was standing in his bathrobe and asking Jeffrey what the hell he thought he was doing as he tried to wrestle the last of his pumpkins from him. Jeffrey had a short and squashy tug of war with Mr. Basque, and finally just had the bright idea to let go of the hateful gourd. Jeffrey's fingers had started to slide through the thin skin at the pumpkin's base anyway, and the last thing he wanted was slime all over his hands. The older man stumbled backward as Jeffrey released his hold and fell on his backside as the pumpkin spattered against him, covering him in soupy guts and rotten seeds. He looked at Jeffrey for a moment, so lost and afraid of this pumpkin demon who had visited its wrath on his house. And for a moment, Jeffrey came to his senses. He started towards him, wanting to help him up. But then the shadow fell across him, and he looked up to find a true demon standing on the sidewalk. He was standing in the shadow of a giant inflatable pumpkin, and the streetlight seemed loath to touch him. He was massive, a huge shadowed figure of steel and green. When he sliced the inflatable with the axe or sword or whatever he carried, it sputtered into death as it puddled on the lawn. Jeffrey was frozen by him for a moment, his terror and anger at the pumpkins paling compared to his madness at the sight of this creature. When it spoke, the voice of winter, and he was once again filled with that potent fire. To hell with him. Your work must be fulfilled. Jeffrey nodded, mounting his bike and riding off without a second glance at the prone man he'd left behind. By the time Jeffrey finished his work, it was nearly midnight. How had it taken so long? He had been so taken by the act of destruction that Jeffrey had lost track of time. He was surprised that no one else had come out to challenge him and wondered how no one had called the police yet. Jeffrey's clothes were spattered with pumpkin, his mask caked with dried seeds and goopy rind, but he didn't feel tired in the least bit. Quite the contrary. Jeffrey felt an almost maniacal need to see more pumpkin squashed beneath his bat. He rode downtown, feeling the cool breeze drive him forward, the chill stoking his blaze of revenge. The fell breeze felt like oncoming winter, and it seemed to lend Jeffrey its power. As Jeffrey rode into downtown, he passed the remains of many smashed jack-o'-lanterns on his way. Chris and Kevin had been busy, it would seem. Tables had been overturned, and the gaping holes from the pumpkins greeted him as he rode. They had thrown them in the street, smashed windows on the storefronts, and scattered guts of numerous gourds everywhere. If Jeffrey had been in his right mind, it would have doubtlessly seemed like a little much. They hadn't agreed on this level of vandalism, nothing even close to this magnitude, but at the same moment, Jeffrey was emboldened by the sight of so much destruction. This was his will, so Jeffrey thought, and he would reward them for their efforts. Jeffrey felt the mist gathering over the town as much as he saw it. Its icy fingers were making chill bumps pop out on his arms, and he found himself looking for the figure from the sidewalk. Jeffrey expected him to appear in the mist and cackle, congratulating Jeffrey for orchestrating such a fine bit of mischief. But if he were there, he was staying hidden for now. Jeffrey found Kevin and Chris on the commons. It seemed that this was where the police had been. The cruiser's blue and white lights were cutting through the fog, but they couldn't hold a candle to the blaze that burned on the commons. Jeffrey gawked at it, speechless, at the towering bonfire the two had created. They had set the greenhouses on fire. They had set a pyre and called the police right to them. In his wonder and disbelief, though, Jeffrey forgot to keep an eye peeled for trouble. Someone pushed him suddenly, spilling him onto the street. They fell on him as they wrenched his arms painfully behind his back, and the fall had knocked the wind out of him. He didn't have any strength to fight them off, and when they lifted Jeffrey to his feet, they shouted for him to stop resisting. Jeffrey was shoved towards the strobing vehicle and pushed into the back seat. He shimmied to the other side, wanting to see if his friends would escape, but what Jeffrey saw was far from what he had expected. Outside, Kevin and Chris were backing into the thick fog that swirled around the commons. The police were moving in, nightsticks in hand, and the cop that had cuffed Jeffrey was moving up behind them as he yelled into his radio. He didn't seem to be reaching the person he wanted, though, because Jeffrey saw him jerk his head away as it crackled and sparked on his shoulder. He cursed and pulled it off, stomping on the box as it caught fire, and looked away from his fellow officers as he tried to put it out. That's why he didn't notice the figure when he came riding out of the fog. Jeffrey saw him, though. He saw his red eyes first, glowing from high in the fog as he came up behind his friends. He was tall, nearly 10 feet, and Jeffrey saw the other two officers freeze as they noticed him. He came between Chris and Kevin, a single hoof, stepping from the fog as his horse parted the mist. His armored form came next. His armor forest green, his horned helm the color of moss, his sword shrieking like a wildcat as he drew it out. Kevin and Chris didn't even look at him. Their pumpkin heads were still fixed on the officers. He was far more fantastic than Jeffrey could have imagined. Neither his dream nor the phantom on the sidewalk had done him justice, and when he charged, the officers broke like quail. Jeffrey heard him laugh, that bitter cackle that had haunted his dreams. When he sliced down at the first officer, the man tried to impose his flimsy nightstick into the path of the vorpal blade. It sheared through the nightsticks and the man's ballistic vest, and finally, through his flesh. He fell to the ground in pieces, and the other two cops looked at those twitching pieces a little too long. The figure laid into them with gusto, and Jeffrey jumped as a head bounced off the front glass and rested on the hood. The riders slew them all, rode them down like children, and when he rode towards the cruiser, Jeffrey knew that he had arrived. The Green Man had returned. He leapt the car and rode into town. Chris and Kevin followed mutely behind him. Jeffrey pivoted in the seat, screaming for them to let him out. He kicked the door, kicked the glass until it splintered into a cascade of spidery cracks. But the rider and his grotesque minions were already disappearing into the fog. They left them there with the bodies. They left him there to take the blame. Jeffrey kicked until his legs ached. He screamed until his throat felt like it would break. He pulled on the cuffs until his wrists bled. In the end, though, it didn't matter in the slightest. More cops arrived as the mist dissipated. Jeffrey was taken to jail, his mask removed, and his identity discovered. He was thrown in a jail cell alone, while the cops tried to sort out the havoc that was going on around town. Calls were coming in from all over the town, and 17 more deaths were reported that night. Fires were blazing in several homes. Broken sprinklers and fire hydrants that had been turned into a bloodbath, and the kids that escaped were saying that it was a guy with a sword and two guys in pumpkin masks with bats. Through it all, Jeffrey just sat in a dejected state in his cell. They had left him. He had been found unworthy, and now he would rot like one of the pumpkins he shattered into so much useless paste. At some point, Jeffrey must have dozed off, because when he returned to himself, the sheriff was leaning against the bars of his cell, sipping coffee from a styrofoam cup. "Good. You're awake." Jeffrey said nothing. "Funny how everything seemed to go to hell the second I decided to leave town for an evening. My granddaughter wanted me to take her trick-or-treating, so I drove to the next town over to oblige her, and come back to a whole mess of problems. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, son?" Jeffrey said nothing. "Funny how you decided to smash up only the pumpkins. You know why the early citizens carved those pumpkins, don't you?" Jeffrey said nothing. "Well, sure you do. The mural in the museum, you've probably seen it 1,000 times and never really thought much of it. The settlers that found this place came fleeing something they prayed they'd left in the old country. That image on the mural with a tide riding down on us, that's not English invaders, as we sometimes pretend for the tourists. Granddad said his granddad told him that it was stories of the Green Man, spirit of winter who sought sacrifice and punished those who would not give him his due." Jeffrey said nothing. "That's why we light the jack-o'-lanterns. That's why the tradition's still here today. We light them so we might forget that demon that once haunted us. We light them because they keep him away. You've left us naked in the breeze, boy. You've burned our greenhouses, smashed our talismans, and now there'll be nothing to stop him from coming back tonight." The sheriff's eyes bore into him, but Jeffrey said nothing. "Did you see him, boy? Did you see that devil?" He wrung his hands over the bars like a drowning man treading water, but Jeffrey refused to answer him. After he'd wrung those bars for a few minutes, the sheriff left. Jeffrey never saw him again. Jeffrey never saw much of anyone again. When he heard the creak and groan of pavement and metal being separated, Jeffrey smiled. He knew they'd come back for him. And when the bars on the street parted from the cement, he looked up to see Kevin and Chris had returned for him. They were still wearing their masks, but Jeffrey had an idea that those masks weren't rubber anymore. Jeffrey had an idea that those masks were permanent now, and his would be too once he slipped it on. Jeffrey crawled onto street level, falling to his knees when he saw that he was with them. The voice in his head told him that he needed one more. These two imps needed a leader. The rider tossed something rubber to the pavement at Jeffrey's feet, and with trembling hands, Jeffrey slid the grotesque pumpkin mask back on. The voice told him that he had work to do. The green man called Jeffrey to action. And who was he to deny him? Since the James Webb Space Telescope launched, we've been seeing images unlike anything witnessed before. These snapshots of space are so clear, showing places so distant, that they reveal the beginnings of galaxies. Through this tool, we can see the past, and the hope is that one day we can observe the beginnings of our own universe. What that might look like could unlock mysteries and answer questions that we haven't yet imagined. But there's been another startling discovery which the general public has not been made aware of yet. We found something in space which scared the living hell out of me. And the worst part is, now that I've seen it, there's no going back. The images coming in from space were beautiful, and I was one of the first to have the opportunity to examine them. I was going over one image recently under intense magnification when I noticed something peculiar. It was a section of space which was unusually dark, lacking any light whatsoever, and some calculations showed that it was headed our way at an alarming rate. The cause of the light obstruction was within the Milky Way, and we had chalked it up to fine dust particles which absorbed light. Those would potentially account for the black blob floating towards Earth from the stars, which made no real sense. But when I examined the image more closely, I realized that I could see something in this new image. Something which our old Hubble telescope would have been unable to make out. That can't be, I muttered to myself in my home office, where I was looking at the picture. It was late at night, and the wind was howling outside as a storm raged on. It was raining, and occasionally claps of thunder were so loud it felt like the house shook with each blast. The power had flicked off and on once, and I was just waiting for it to happen again. There's no way. It has to be an artifact. I downloaded a new copy of the image in case something had been corrupted during the file transfer. With such large images, it was always possible, though extremely unlikely. When I received the new image, I zoomed in on the section once again. I had saved the coordinates on the picture, so I knew exactly where it was, and once again, there was the same distinctive shape. A dark blob swirling among the stars in our galaxy. But within it were familiar dark shapes resembling worms or millipedes. I picked up my cell phone, ignoring the time of night, and phoned another astronomer who had access to these preliminary images. They hadn't been released to the public yet, and they were classified. They were only available to a few of us. He picked up the phone, and I was worried that he would be annoyed with me calling so late, but he was up looking at the new images as well. Do me a favor, I said. Check out image 254, zoom in, close at x1.202, y5.200. Tell me what you see. All right, he answered, zooming in on x1202, y5.20, and... whoa. What is that? An artifact? I let out a deep exhale. I'm not crazy. You see them too. This can't be real. I wish it wasn't. The next day, the two of us set to work trying to figure out what exactly our theory was before we could try to prove it. This hypothesis could cost us our careers, even if we were right. Those things, what exactly are we looking at? David asked, leaning close to the giant computer monitor in my office. I let out a sigh. I was hoping he wouldn't make me say it out loud. They look like worms, I admitted. But you see that too, right? He nodded reluctantly, but didn't say anything. They'd have to be huge, bigger than stars, bigger than solar systems. Nothing like that exists. At least nothing we know of. You remember Galactus, the planet eater? He asked. I tried to smile, but I couldn't. We need to get another image, maybe more than just one, but first let's show Scott what we have here. Let's outline the shapes, try to present them as convincingly as we can. Our careers are on the line here. David didn't sound too enthusiastic. I knew he was a skeptic and would find a way to explain whatever this was, no matter what. Still, the two of us set to work, outlining the shapes in the darkness among the stars. He kept muttering that it was just an artifact. We were wasting our time. But I found that not only could I see dark worms, but legs underneath them. Many, many legs. Like enormous star-eating millipedes. I shuddered at the thought, recalling the calculations which showed the dark blob was heading towards Earth at an alarming speed. Eventually, David went home, and I got the feeling he was starting to think I was crazy. But if I was wrong, then what was the alternative explanation? He didn't seem to have an answer for that. That night, I went to sleep and had terrible nightmares. After staring at the computer screen all day, I imagined those dark millipedes squirming and wriggling their way out of my computer monitor, their fat bodies dropping onto my desk as they began to feast on our world, starting with my home office. Like termites, they began to eat my desk, starting with a wooden desktop, and then they quickly devoured the legs, moving onto my chair next. Their bodies grew fatter as they consumed everything in the room, revealing only darkness behind the facade of my furniture. And pretty soon it was impossible to distinguish the millipedes from the blackness all around me. I was floating in space, no stars. And the millipedes had run out of food. There was only one thing left to eat. Me. As they surrounded me on all sides, they began to crawl from the darkness onto my fingertips, onto my nose, and onto my eyelids, skittering across my skin with their innumerable legs, finding their way into any opening they could. And once they had eaten my eyes, I was left floating in darkness. Cold, impenetrable darkness which pressed in on me like 1,000,000 tons of weight, compressing me as my body was consumed by a galaxy of worms. I woke up with a gasp, nearly screaming until I realized an instant later that it was all a dream. I mean, not a dream. A horrible, surreal nightmare. The worst one I'd ever experienced in my life. It felt too real. Scared to go back to sleep, I got out of bed and went to the kitchen to make coffee. The computer was sitting in the corner, dark and silent. I wandered over to it and turned it on, inhaling the smell of freshly brewed coffee while I waited for it to boot up. Once I was logged into the server, I pulled up that same image again. What the hell? My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the screen. The black blob in the image was bigger than before, almost double. But it was the same picture. That was impossible. I looked through the archive and checked to see if another image had been taken of the same quadrant, but there was nothing. The telescope had moved on to capture other images, redirecting its camera to observe a black hole in a completely different section of space. Zooming in on the image, I saw the black millipedes even more distinctly now. I picked up my cell phone and I called David immediately. He picked up, sounding groggy and annoyed. "Who is this? Do you have any idea what time it is?" he slurred. "It's me. Hey, listen. You need to do something for me. Pull up that image again, the one with the worms." "Not this again. You really need to drop this, man. I'm trying to be nice here, but this is getting to be too much. David, I need you to listen to me. You need to look at it again. It's bigger." He had already hung up on me. I realized then that I was on my own. I'd have to present this information to the bosses myself. It would be up to them to decide what to do with it. Unfortunately, David beat me to the punch. By the time I got to the office, he was already in with Scott, our boss. They were looking at the image together, and David was saying something quietly behind the desk to him when I came in. "Ah, you're here," Scott said. "David was just showing me what you found." "And what do you think it is?" The two of them eyed me up and down, making me feel small. "You know, it's just an artifact, right? I mean, it's pretty clear." "Don't you think they look like worms? Millipedes?" "Trust me, sir, I know how crazy this sounds." "I'm not sure that you do. David said he tried to explain this to you, but you're not getting it. We can't have analysts on the team who can't tell the difference between the plausible and the impossible." "Sir, what does that even mean?" It means you're fired. Your access with the JWST images has been revoked. From now on, You can see whatever we release to the public, just like everyone else. Sir, come on, please. I know how this sounds, but you have to believe me. I'm a rational person, but these worms, they're getting bigger. I mean, just since yesterday, they're fatter, larger. They're eating the fucking stars while we sit here. We talk about whether they exist or not. See, this is what I'm talking about, David said. He didn't need to say it, though. I cringed at how deranged I sounded. I'm calling security. Leave your badge with them. Feel free to get the hell out of my office, Grimes, Scott said, looking back down at the screen again. And a few minutes later, I was out on the street. No job, no car, since that was a company lease. And pretty soon, I'd have nowhere to live either, since nobody was likely to hire me after my dismissal, especially given the reasons why I was let go. The field's a very small one. Word gets around fast. All I had left of my previous life was the image on my computer. The screenshot I had taken of the wormhole, as I had come to call it. When I pulled it up on my computer again, the dark spot at the center of the image was even more pronounced than before. I zoomed in on it using the highest level of magnification possible. And I let out a soft gasp of horror when I noticed something for the first time. I could actually see the worms moving now within the image. I could see them feasting on the glow which surrounded them, consuming the light from nearby stars, eating planets and entire galaxies with each swift snap of their jaws. I closed the image suddenly, my heart jackhammering in my chest. Suddenly, I wanted to get rid of the computer, to throw the whole thing in the dumpster outside. But I knew that I wouldn't be able to sleep if I did that. I knew it would only fester and boil inside of me if I couldn't see the progress of these universe-consuming worms. So that's what I've done. Every day I wake up and I look at the image. I stare in a horrified wonderment at what is coming for us all. I'm sure my boss must know by now, David as well. But they haven't reached out to apologize or say anything to me. Part of me wonders... I best not to think of those things. But still, part of me wonders if the worms can consume thoughts. If they're not limited in their ability to digest the universe, but can also consume things more metaphysical than stars. Can they eat our memories? Can they make us blind to them? How else can I be the only one who sees them? And maybe the worms are laughing at me, knowing that only I can see them. They make others see what they want to see. All the while consuming the stars and growing larger and fatter, getting closer to us by the day. And I wish that was my biggest concern right now. I really do. If that were the case, I'd still have time. I'd have years, maybe decades. There's a bigger problem. I should have thrown out the computer. One day I pulled up the image and the worms had consumed all of it. They had reached the furthest margins of the massive image, feasting on every star and galaxy along the way. I tried to close it quickly, seeing these squirming and wriggling their way across the borders of the image, but it was too late. The fat black millipedes made it across the screen onto my desktop, where the corners of the image met my computer monitor. They wriggled over and began to multiply immediately. The main image was closed, but I could still see the worms feasting on the edges of my desktop. They clambered over the side of the flat surface. My desktop background was a serene landscape of green rolling fields with a sunny blue sky dotted with clouds above, but now it looked infected with a swiftly spreading black plague that multiplied with each passing second. I screamed. I turned off the monitor as quickly as I could, hoping that would get rid of them. Hoping they'd be limited to existing inside the flickering screen, but instead they persisted. And worse yet, I looked down to see one or two of them on the finger I used to push the power button. I tried to wash them off, but they were tenacious. They refused to leave my hand. They spread across my skin, and I could feel them. I could feel them taking over. I could still use my phone with my other hand. I've been debating calling family or friends to tell them what I don't know, but instead, I've chosen to spend my last remaining hours typing this, sharing this with all of you, because maybe this is all my fault. Maybe I should have just left well enough alone. If I hadn't looked so closely into the darkness, I might not have seen what truly was lying within. But now that it's done, I need to be straight with you all. You need to know. You deserve to know. So you can make your peace with loved ones, with friends and family. and those that you've wronged. Only so much time remains. They're here. The worms that feast on light and leave only darkness in their wake, they're here. And they're multiplying. Quickly. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I want to tell you thanks so much for watching tonight's video or listening to tonight's episode of the podcast. Quick reminder, I am also a narrator over at Chilling. If you guys like the stories that you're listening to here, then I'm sure you'll like the stories that you can listen to over at Chilling, because they're almost the same thing. I'm still narrating them, but you can select your own background music or background sounds, and you can select a whole mess of other narrators, such as Autumn Ivy, Swamp Dweller, and a bunch of my other friends. If you guys are interested in checking out Chilling app, starting up with a free trial, you can use the link in the description down below. Or you can head over to thechillingapp.com and also use those free trials to win prizes from their giveaways. And as always, I would love to give a big thank you to everyone who's supporting me over on Patreon. You guys are the real MVPs. You guys keep things going, especially while things have been nuts for me over the past couple of months, and things have been getting crazier and crazier as time goes on. You guys are the ones who are keeping me sane, and I mean that with all sincerity, that you guys have helped me immensely. So, in my personal life and my professional life, I want to give a very big thank you to Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Jacob Bensky, Chance Brenna, Diana Kraus, LaQueda, Canizales, MrCreepyPasta, Pedal Pleaser, Caddis, Joseph Calarudo, Would It Be, Dante Kinkade, Foxhound 803, Mephistopheles, CursepoxPrimarch, Bastion Beefcake, Jeff the Killer's Cultist, Love You M, Insanity Gamer X, Jesus Cornejo, Yarghoul, Clark, kearns, himbojerry, Samahai, CrusaderChocobo, Adamarius, Captain Scurvy, Estadine, Braden Morris, Nate Cull, Our Minsect Time, Angelus, Seclude, That Creepy Chick, Red Shadow Cat, Xavier and Cheyenne, 6 Gay Rats in a Trench Coat, Turtleman, Cryolinium, Lord Life's Best, Gorang Trimagazine, Mr. Marcus Blitz, Michael Limchock, Dirk Diver 030, Matt Bach, Voice of Sand, Shelly J, Fikamel, Deleted Account, Melted Lake, Tully Sue, William King, Sashi Suzaku, Stricken, Freddy Krueger, Happy Birthday Jason Wilson, Lisa Cottrell, Caspian, Hades Nephew, Tater Chip, Acid System, Mog, Kiri the Sloth, Fester's Lampshade, Nico Kaya, The Ginger Bros, and Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, and Corey Kenshin. To everyone on this list, everyone in the description, and of course anyone who could support even just $1, thank you all so much for making my life significantly easier with this. And if you guys would like to be able to join any of the names that you see here or down there or anything at all, head over to patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta. And with that, I wish you all a very, very pleasant night and sweet dreams.